Chapter 3063. Fu Yuheng put his hand on his waist and felt that it was still painful. But strangely, he wasn't angry. He looked at the door and was silent for a while. Then, he bit his lip, walked slowly to the sofa, and sat down. The pain came quickly, but it was mostly gone after a while. Tiny bits of pain came from his face. He reached out and touched his face. To his surprise, he found traces of blood. He thought about his rashness just now and carefully recalled what he said just now. He did look like a prostitute. He was just stunned for a moment, but he wasn't stupid. His impulsive attitude just now was not only because he was blinded by her temptation, but also because he was looking forward to it. After all, if she really took the initiative to hug him and ask for the material price, he would be disappointed. This kind of vague feeling of relief was a little ridiculous. But at least he could be sure that she was not like Bai Xiaoyu at all. Fu Yuheng rubbed his face and frowned when he felt the pain. She was like a stray cat. And the kind that hadn't been tamed. Fu Yuheng sighed slightly. He felt that he had been paying too much attention to her recently. And his methods were despicable. Dealing with a little girl. These methods and words were a little despicable. Fu Yuheng, who had always been expected to follow the rules and behave like a young master of a big family. For the first time, he knew how despicable he could be. They were in these circles. There was no shortage of animals to bully women. He didn't expect that he was one of them. He sat in silence for a while, then slowly got up and opened the bathroom door, intending to take a cold shower to calm down. But just as he walked in, he saw the girl's shorts and suspenders thrown to the side of the bathtub. His eyes froze. After being speechless for a while, he walked over and picked up the clothes. The clothes were so small. He glanced at the suspenders. Why were they so small? He couldn't help but tug at the suspenders and found that they were elastic, and very elastic. The clothes perfectly wrapped around the girl's slender body. It revealed the young but beautiful lines of her body. After tugging for a while, he realized how perverted his actions were. The young man, who was planning to do something worse than a beast, couldn't help but blush. He pursed his lips and put the clothes in the laundry basket. In the end, he saw that the clothes he had just thrown here when he was showering were tangled with her clothes. Just looking at it made one's head heat up. He looked at it expressionlessly and realized that he couldn't stay still. The bathroom was filled with an unfamiliar, soft scent. This feeling of having his territory invaded was actually not uncomfortable. But it was very troublesome. His breathing was a little disorderly as he silently lowered his head. His deep eyes carried traces of uncontrollable trembling. His heart palpitated slightly. Ding, the male lead's favorability is at 20. After Fu Yuheng calmed down, he walked out of the bathroom with an indifferent expression. He originally wanted to go downstairs to drink water. He thought that she might be scolding him downstairs. He lowered his eyes and hesitated for a moment before giving up on the idea of going downstairs. For the first time, he was in his own home. It was almost like living under someone else's roof. Fu Yuheng turned back to the computer. It was time for the meeting. When he opened the video, he realized that his face was still covered in blood. Meanwhile, the employees who had just come online and their business partners were instantly amused. Fuck, little boss, who did you just fight 300 rounds with? That's too explosive. Fu Yuheng looked up coldly with an expressionless face. Slash. T. Chapter 3064. However, he had always been cold and steady. The little boss who beat them up every day and suppressed them to the point of death. To think that he had actually exposed his pathetic side. It was a young company. The young employees were even more fearless and laughed. It's good to be young, you can still continue to work. Little boss, don't stay up all night. You have a girlfriend. If you stay up all night and lose your hair, your little girlfriend will run away. Fu Yuheng, the panda who was surrounded by onlookers, bent down calmly and took out the first aid kit from the drawer. Then he calmly took out the OK tape and looked at himself in the video as if he was a mirror. He stuck the OK tape on the wound on his face. He didn't feel embarrassed at all. He was terrifyingly calm. Those laughing and joking voices also gradually disappeared. Even under the calm of the Demon King Little Boss, everyone gradually felt the terrifying pressure again. Demon King Fu stuck the OK tape on the bridge of his nose and one on his cheek. After he was done, he unhurriedly took out a stack of documents, spread them out, and began to read out a bunch of projects. Some people need to go on a business trip. Whoever was the most enthusiastic just now will go. After saying that, Fu Yuheng read out the location of the business trip. They were all in small countries in the third world. If they went, there might not be anyone left. Suddenly, a bunch of people fell on their faces and begged for mercy. Wei Wei Bai, who heard the favorability notification, turned over, wrapped herself in the blanket and closed her eyes to sleep. The host and system were as calm as an old dog. They weren't interested in the fluctuation of favorability. But the system, who was knitting a small hat for itself, still asked, "Is the male lead a masochist?" He was kicked so badly, but his favorability still rose. Wei Wei Bai explained in a daze, "He's not a masochist, but he's emotionally blank and still naive. So when he sees a girl who isn't moved by money, it's easy to have favorability." No matter how steady and mature Fu Yuheng looked, he was still a 19-year-old kid. No matter how good his family education was, he wasn't thrown into the slums or the assassin camp to train. No matter how good he was in other things, it didn't mean that he was very emotional. How could a boy of this age not have a hot-blooded side? He was really a mature driver. Not to mention that she wanted to use the bathroom. Even if he really stripped naked and forced himself on her, he would not feel anything. But at Fu Yuheng's age, not to mention borrowing a bathroom. If there was a girl in the family, there would definitely be a different feeling in his heart. Of course, the prerequisite was that the girl was pretty. Yes, that was what she looked like. No other girl can compare to her. Therefore, it would be strange if the little boy did not panic. Wei Wei Bai sighed. "I'm so beautiful. That's why it's so old-fashioned. Girl, I like you. How dare you insult me with money? I'll beat you to death." Boy? Aw, this girl actually likes me and not my money. She's so pure and not pretentious. She's just different from those flirtatious B***cheese outside. That's right, that's how the favorability would increase. His tricks were so trashy. Even Fu Yuheng had taken the bait. Sure enough, her beauty had played a huge role. "Why are you boasting again? Could it be that you're hinting at me to buy some skincare products again?" When the system thought of this, it silently opened the supermarket catalog. "Oh, there's a delicate and soft essence. Not expensive, buy, throw it on the host. There's also a lip protector, the kind that has a sweet taste when kissing. It guarantees that the lips will look so good that there's no need to wear lipstick. Not expensive, buy, apply it on the host." Wei Wei Bai, who was sleeping. Chapter 3065. Wei Wei Bai felt that she had become prettier again. She looked at herself in the mirror, and her keen sense of beauty was immediately activated. Like a radar, it swept across her face. Yes, her lips had become prettier. She frowned. Could it be that her beauty could be updated automatically? When she woke up early in the morning, her mood immediately improved. She washed her face, then picked out a more conservative short-sleeved t-shirt from the closet. Not to mention the collarbone line. She didn't even have a bra line. Didn't Fu Yuheng dislike her for showing off? She was starting to be conservative. Bai Weiwei had always disliked the idea of having too many tricks up her sleeve. Living under someone else's roof was the age of fire. A single man and a single woman. It was like a peach that had just ripened. If she didn't do some tricks, how could she live up to her beautiful youth? She wore long jeans, which were super loose, and a flat-chested t-shirt. She walked out in her slippers. It was only 7:00. The nanny had probably just finished preparing breakfast. She went to the dining room. She saw Fu Yuheng sitting at the dining table. He had glasses on the bridge of his nose, and his eyes were still clear behind the glasses. If it weren't for the shadow of staying up late. She felt that he had just woken up. Weiwei Bai ignored her and pulled out a chair. The nanny came over and served her porridge. She casually thanked him. The nanny glanced at her but didn't say anything. It was just that there were more side dishes and deep-fried dough sticks for her. The Fu family's breakfast was usually bland. An overly refined diet was not popular. After all, the appetite was too delicate and was not good for health. Weiwei Bai didn't think so much. It was fine as long as the food was delicious. Fu Yuheng had just finished eating and was sitting at the dining table reading the newspaper slowly. For a moment, there was only the sound of the girl eating silently at the dining table. Through the gap in the newspaper, the young man slowly looked up and saw the clothes she was wearing. His eyes were stunned. These days, he was used to her little suspenders and shorts. For a moment, it was a little strange to see the girl dressed so conservatively. Her long hair was tied into a simple high ponytail, and her beautiful hairline was casually scattered, natural little hair and some fine strands of hair. Her beautiful face was filled with the purity and beauty of youth. Even if it was just a simple t-shirt and trousers, it still looked very fresh. Fu Yuheng stared at her for a few seconds before he forced himself to look away and read the newspaper. However, he realized that the words on the newspaper were densely packed. This caused him to become distracted. Fu Yuheng read the newspaper calmly, but he couldn't understand a single word. Suddenly, he heard a young girl's soft but incomparably cold voice. "I'm moving out." He tightened his grip on the newspaper and remained silent for a while. Only then did Fu Yuheng calmly put down the newspaper, revealing his calm and handsome face. Weiwei Bai looked up and met his eyes. There was not a trace of hesitation in his eyes, nor was there any intention of dodging. She put down the unfinished youtiao and wiped her hands with a napkin. The young girl's beautiful fingers were fair and tender. Her round nails were stained with some oil and were slightly red and alluring. She wiped her hands nonchalantly and said, "I'm sorry to have troubled you for so many days." Although it was an apology. However, his tone was still filled with anger. There was no sincerity in apologizing at all. It was extremely perfunctory. Weiwei Bai looked at the young man's calm face and said very calmly, "After all, you've already found me a good university and promised that you'll pay for my university tuition and living expenses. One can't be too heartless." Chapter 3066. At this point, she paused for a moment. "So if you want me to leave, I'll leave obediently." After saying that, her lips curled up into a nonchalant smile. "After all, I'm not the kind of person who can be so thick-skinned and refuse to leave." Fu Yuheng stared at her deeply for a few seconds before reaching out to take off his glasses. Having not slept for a night, his eyes were a little blurred and his hair was a little messy. The young man with the decadent aura had a kind of stunning dark and beautiful temperament. His expression was cold. When are you moving out? Neither of them mentioned what happened last night. But it was still like a bomb. The atmosphere between them was tense to the point that it smelled of gunpowder. Wei Wei Bai lazily lifted her eyelids and said coldly as if he didn't care, "These 2 days, I'll pack my things." Fu Yuheng was silent for a moment before saying indifferently, "Do you have a place to stay?" Wei Wei Bai got up and replied indifferently, "Why are you wasting your time? Even if I sleep on the streets, it's none of your business." Besides, at this point, the girl smiled. Cold and mocking. "Am I not just a prostitute in your eyes? Are you afraid that I don't have a place to stay? In your heart, my sugar daddy's bed is enough for me to sleep in." This sentence was meant to provoke. It could even be said to be presumptuous and unreasonable. Fu Yuheng's expression was indifferent and his eyes narrowed slightly. After all, he was a pampered person who was used to being in a superior position. For a moment, he didn't like being pointed at and mocked. He was about to retort when he looked up and saw the girl in front of him. Her beautiful eyes showed a hint of unwillingness to avoid his gaze. She was as sharp as a hedgehog. Only in the light of her eyes, there were remnants of hurt softness. Fu Yuheng kept all the words in his mouth and didn't say a single word. After Wei Wei Bai finished speaking, she was stunned for a moment. It seemed that these words were indeed unpleasant to hear. She was silent for a moment before laughing self-deprecatingly. "Forget it, I'll leave once I'm done packing. In the future, when my mother is chased away, remember to inform me." Speaking of her mother, her voice weakened. "She's just vain. She might not stop when she sees that your father is rich. You should keep an eye on her." Wei Wei Bai finished speaking and was about to leave. However, he heard the calm voice of the youth behind him. "If your mother succeeds in staying, won't your life be better?" It was better to be gentle with this sentence. To put it bluntly, if Bai Xiaoyu succeeded, Wei Wei Bai could also become a phoenix from a pheasant. She paused in her footsteps, her back facing him. For some reason, she felt a sense of bleakness and fragility. At last she spoke in a flat voice. "You can live as long as you have money, okay? All I know is that my life has long been ruined. No matter how much money you give me, it won't give me a normal mother, let alone a normal childhood." Here she said in a low voice of derision. "You're so lucky. Don't always talk about other people. If I were you, I would also write you a check and ask you to sell it to me." These words were slightly gloomy. It was as if she was choking. "I only liked you for a few days. It doesn't mean that you can always hold on to this mistake of mine." Liking him was a mistake. Fu Yuheng's eyes froze. The girl had already left the dining table and walked up the stairs. She turned back, there was no trace of sadness on her face. "In the future, I won't overestimate myself unlike a young master like you. Don't worry." After saying that, she went upstairs without looking back. From beginning to end, she didn't look at him. Fu Yuheng sat on the chair, his eyes deep and cold. His white fingertips touched the newspaper. After a long time, he picked up the newspaper and continued reading. But he found that he couldn't read it. Last night, to her, was it too much? Ding, the male lead's favorability is at 25. / to read the full article. To TXT. Download to read the full article. Chapter 3067. Fu Yuheng found that the house had suddenly quietened down. It was the hottest time of the summer vacation, and the heat was everywhere. He had been busy outside for several days, and only returned home after 10 at night. If it was in the past, he might have just stayed in the apartment next to the group and rested for a few nights. After all, it was a critical period for the group's transformation recently. After dealing with too many people, he began to suffer an unimaginable backlash. Many people began to band together to resist the policy of excluding him. He knew that once this difficulty passed, it would be considered to be over. The old man's life before retirement would be much better. He would also get a few years of free time to develop his own company. At such a critical time, he clearly didn't need to come back. When Fu Yuheng opened the door, the living room was empty. It was still the same as before, empty and bright. There was no sign of life. He took off his shoes, and his suit jacket hung at his elbow. Traces of sweat had already appeared on his white thin shirt. The faint lines of muscles on his back and the thin outline of his waist were exposed. The air conditioner in the room seemed to be broken. He looked up at the air conditioner. He found that it wasn't on. He walked over and picked up the remote control, but found that it really couldn't be turned on. Fu Yuheng couldn't help but feel a little irritated. He walked straight to the refrigerator, opened the door, and saw the food left by the nanny who cooked. Some girls liked ice cream, sugar water, and watermelon in a bowl that had been cut and sealed with plastic wrap. All of this happened when he was alone. Things that didn't exist. He took out the cold mineral water, opened the lid, and drank 2 mouthfuls. The dry and hot feeling was still there. Fu Yuheng looked at the fruit and sugar water in the refrigerator expressionlessly. It was mung bean soup. He tilted his head and thought for a moment. Finally, he hesitated for a moment before taking out the fruit and the frozen mung bean soup in a glass bowl. When he returned to the room, he put the things in a more conspicuous place on the table. He also cleaned up the documents and debris on the table. The air conditioner in the room wasn't broken. And it was always on. Fu Yuheng went to take a shower expressionlessly. After taking a shower, he glanced at the door of the room. No one had opened it. He lowered his eyes and stood there for a while, then calmly went to organize the work documents. The computer was on, and there was a game at the bottom of the desktop that had not been deleted. He raised his eyebrows and stared at the game. Once again, he had the urge to delete it. But for some reason, his finger almost went in. It was a login page for the game. As for the nickname and password, it was saved and could be accessed directly. He hesitated for a moment before logging in. Nickname, Chiomi Kohit stared at Chiomi, unable to understand what she meant. But he instinctively felt that it was cute. After logging in, he was greeted by a colorful immortal cultivation screen. All the servers were packed with people. He glanced at the game, then opened the search page and searched for the game company. He realized that it was a company that he had invested in. This year, a game had exploded in popularity, making his investment extremely successful. But to him, this was much more profitable than an investment. It was still just a small addition to his performance plan. It was completely insignificant. As a result, he had no recollection of it at all. In a game with an immortal cultivation background, all the characters were beautifully designed. He glanced at the character that Wei Wei Bai had chosen. It was a man. Chapter 3068. He was a Buddhist disciple, holding prayer beads in his hand. He was bald and wore a kasaya. Fu Yuheng was speechless. What was going on with this name? It was a little strange. He glanced at the game and wondered why he even logged in to take a look. After logging in, he stared at the game and hesitated for a few seconds before giving up on the urge to delete it. After all, it was a game that he had invested in. He could occasionally check its performance. Fu Yuheng convinced himself and continued reading the documents after taking a sip of water. After reading for a while, he glanced at the door again. After a few seconds, he calmed down and continued reading the documents. Then, he signed, closed the document, and continued reading the next document. 11:30 p.m. She didn't seem to have eaten supper. For some reason, this thought flashed through Fu Yuheng's mind. He rationally and coldly suppressed this thought. He felt that he had been paying too much attention to Wei Wei by recently. He didn't even think that this was a feeling of fondness. It was just that, he felt that he had gone overboard. Then, he felt a little guilty. This bit of guilt was a novelty to him. After all, he had destroyed so many people, and he had just watched indifferently. Yet, he felt a little guilty towards a little girl who was living under someone else's roof. Fu Yuheng thought about it for a while. Perhaps it was because those people he had destroyed were his enemies, his opponents, and all of them were strong. He saw it as a challenge. The winner takes all, and there was nothing to say. But Wei Wei Bai wasn't like that. She was weak, and even pitiful. Bullying her would make him seem inhumane. Fu Yuheng stared at the document and finally pushed it aside. Then, he glanced at the sweet soup on the table. He hesitated for a while. This was the first time he had experienced such a strange hesitation. Finally, he was strong enough to take action. He picked up the green bean soup and walked up to the second floor. Fu Yuheng came to Wei Wei Bai's door and knocked. He found that no one answered. He frowned. At this time, she wasn't here. Could it be that she had moved away? As soon as this thought came to him, he opened the door without much consideration and found that it wasn't locked. He was really caught off guard. He saw that the room was indeed empty. Furthermore, the air conditioner was not turned on, and a stuffy feeling rushed towards him. Fu Yuheng's fingers tightened around the bowl. Then, he glanced at the furnishings in the room. Half of the things were already packed. The suitcase was placed on the bed, and the clothes were scattered all over the bed. There were 2 big bags beside the bed, which seemed to be the girl's own luggage. The bag was a little shabby and cheap. He looked at it for a while, then moved his eyes away indifferently. Then, he walked to the living room and put the soup on the table. The air was still stuffy. He sat on the sofa, waiting for something. As time passed, he finally heard the sound of the door opening. And her voice on the phone. "That's right. Come and help me move my things tomorrow morning. My mom thought that I could stay here for a long time, so she put all my things here. It's very troublesome for me to move them out first. Moving companies are too expensive. I'm penniless now, so I can only stay at your place for a few nights." Wei Wei Bai said as she slowly ate her ice cream. She didn't notice that there was another person in the living room. It seemed that the person on the other side of the phone was in a dilemma. Wei Wei Bai smiled. Brother, you're the best. You definitely can't bear to let me out on the streets. Don't worry, I'll cook for you, wash your clothes, and do anything to repay you. Chapter 3069. When the delicate and pretty girl smiled, the corners of her lips curved up like a blooming flower. Her eyes were filled with gentleness. It was as if she was about to confess in the next moment. The young man sitting on the sofa's eyelashes trembled slightly. He slowly lifted his eyelids, revealing the deep coldness in his eyes. He watched her slowly walk up the stairs. Perhaps it was because of the heat, the t-shirt she was wearing was casually tied at the waist, revealing the fair skin of her waist. The girl's waist was extremely slender, without a trace of excess flesh. They were all tender and fair, and when he touched them, it was as if it could turn into sweet water and wrap around him. Fu Yuheng's dark eyes coldly looked at the slender figure. When she walked up the stairs, he could still vaguely hear her flirting with the person on the other end of the phone. His gaze fell on the green bean sugar water. After a long time, he slowly got up, picked up the bowl, and walked to the kitchen to pour it out. That bit of guilt was turned into a dark and sharp thing by the girl's careless tone of betraying herself. It actually made him a little angry. Wei Wei Bai returned to the room, smiled, and put down the phone. The phone's screen was still black, and it was even locked. It didn't look like it was on the phone. She didn't make a call at all. She just saw little brother Fu Yuheng sitting on the sofa, a little lonely and pitiful. If she let him get some stimulation, he wouldn't be lonely. She was a good person. She took the phone to charge and Wei Wei Bai turned on the air conditioner. Then she started to pack. The best strategy was of course to be in the same room. But she couldn't really be stubborn. The character was the key. Don't get involved with Bai Xiaoyu. Even if you don't live here for a while. You can still meet her when you're in school. When the time came, it would be a youthful and fresh campus romance. It was also good. Wei Wei Bai chatted with the system for a while. The system was knitting a big hat for Wei Wei Bai. The storm in the spacetime tunnel was very cold. After he knitted a hat for himself, he wanted to knit one for her. When the time came, she would wear it on her soul. It wouldn't be cold. They were both knitted from the same sweater. It was a festive sight to see one big and one small. As he knitted, he said, "There's still a long time, so it doesn't matter where you go. But where do you want to live after you go out? You don't have enough money in your bank account to live." Wei Wei Bai, "I'll report to school in advance. I'll just stay in the dormitory." As they discussed, they packed their luggage. Wei Wei Bai realized that she was hungry. She had only eaten an ice cream and had not eaten dinner yet. She thought of the supper that was always prepared in Fu Yuheng's kitchen. She rubbed her stomach and felt that the best thing about Fu Yuheng's place was that the supper was delicious. Wei Wei Bai yawned and looked at the time. It was already 12:00. Most likely, the traumatized teenager had gone to sleep. Or stay up late to work. It was good to be young. In a few more years, with such crazy work, the possibility of sudden death would be high. She went to take a shower first before walking down the stairs. Her footsteps were light. He planned to go to bed after eating supper. Greasy old salted fish's conqueror was unusually calm about everything. The system also went to sleep. In the empty living room, there was only Wei Wei Bai softly humming a cheerful song. She went to the kitchen and first looked at the thermos. It was empty. Then, she looked at the rice cooker. It was empty. Not only was it empty, it had not been washed. It seemed that the food had just been eaten, and only the pot was left. Her calm heart was at a loss. Then, she went to the refrigerator to look for something. Tea. Chapter 3070. The fridge was more than half empty. There was basically only mineral water left. The rest of the snacks, fruits, desserts, were all gone. Wei Wei Bai's expression turned cold. Who was it that ate all the food? Did Fu Yuheng have guests today? Were there more than 10 naughty kids? Otherwise, how could they eat so much? She suddenly smelled something at the tip of her nose. Normally, she would not notice this kind of smell. But in the middle of the night, she was hungry again. She smelled all kinds of smells, especially the sweet smell of food. She opened the trash can to take a look. The trash can was full of food. Then, she looked at the place where the kitchen waste was placed. Damn it, all the food was poured into a bucket. Wei Wei Bai, she clutched her stomach, her face full of grief and indignation. Fu Yuheng, you wasteful bastard. For someone who was hungry in the middle of the night, it was painful to find that all her food had been thrown into the trash can. It made people want to kill her to keep her mouth shut. What was worse was that many of the snacks' packaging were deliberately torn open. It was to prevent the contents of the snacks from being contaminated by the trash can. It made her want to go against her conscience, pick up the packaged snacks, wash them, and then open them for new snacks, but she couldn't do it. Fu Yuheng was too ruthless. He even killed her heart. How could rich people spoil snacks, desserts, and fruits like this? Fu Yuheng looked at the fruits on the table indifferently. He forgot to throw them away. He got up and was about to throw them away. But then, there was a loud knocking sound on the door. Fu Yuheng stopped in his tracks and looked at the door coldly. His expression didn't change as he picked up the fruits and walked to the trash can. The door suddenly opened. As soon as Bai Weiwei pushed open the door, she saw the son of AB*TCH holding the last glass bowl of fruit. He was going to throw it into the trash can. She didn't say anything and ran over immediately. But just as her fingers touched the fruit, the youth in front of her looked up calmly and loosened his fingers. Just a second before Weiwei Bai touched the fruit fell into the trash can with a thud. Weiwei Bai, not only did he hurt her heart, he even insulted her stomach. Fu Yuheng looked at her coldly before he took a tissue from the table and wiped his hands. He threw it into the trash can and covered it with the fruit. Weiwei Bai was angry. She suddenly reached out and grabbed his finger. She said fiercely, "Fu Yuheng, I'm about to leave, and you won't even give me this bit of face before I leave. Why are you deliberately bullying me?" Her fingers were a little cold. Her body's fragrance was the coolness after a bath. It was just like the ice cream she ate. Her soft lips were stained with the color of the ice cream, and the feeling of her tongue licking it lazily. Fu Yuheng didn't expect that he would remember that scene so clearly with just a glimpse. Perhaps it was because he had held back for too long. That was probably why he was so angry. His fingertips twitched, and the girl tightened her grip. She glared at him coldly, her beautiful eyelashes fluttering like a butterfly's wings. His eyes were also stained with fire because of his anger, and it was incomparably clear. Fu Yuheng lowered his head and said, "Let go." His voice was so low that it was close to gentleness. But this gentleness gave people the dangerous feeling of a venomous snake. Bai Weiwei sneered, "If you hate me, just say it directly. Just directly scold me. We can directly fight. What I hate the most is that kind of indifference on the surface, but behind it." At https://www.sashu.com/quick to read the full text, https://www.sashu.com/quick to txt download the full text, https://www.sashu.com quick to read the full text, https://sashu.com quick. Chapter 3071. She looked him up and down. Her cold smile turned into sarcastic sarcasm. A eunuch who only knows how to scheme behind his back. After saying that, she shook off his hand as if venting her anger. "I'll leave tomorrow so that I don't have to see a two-faced bastard like you." After saying that, she raised her proud little head and turned to walk towards the door. The door was open. Before she could walk out of the door, a hand firmly pressed against the door in the next moment. The half-open door was pressed down hard. There was a loud bang. The door closed. Bai Weiwei froze for a moment. Before she could react, a huge force pulled at her arm. Then her whole body was pressed against the door by this force. The youth's strong aura attacked her. He didn't even stretch out his hand to hold the door and form an encirclement. Instead, he directly pressed his body against hers. With an incomparably strong posture, he squeezed out the space she had to escape. Her body pressed against him. She felt the youth's hot skin that was close to boiling. His face was still cold, and his beautiful eyes were dark, so dark that she couldn't see the bottom. It made the slow-witted girl feel a sense of fear in hindsight. It was like a hunter who had been hibernating in the grass for a long time, and finally revealed his sharp claws to fiercely slap the small animal eating grass. And the small animal was dumbfounded. She didn't even know that her appearance had attracted a man-eating monster. Fu Yuheng saw that her appearance was fierce but cowardly. At this moment, she had already revealed panic, as if she had finally sensed the danger and wanted to avoid it. But he calmly reached out his hand, passed through her smooth long hair, and clasped her slender neck. His fingertips rubbed against her soft skin. He used so much force that it was close to bad, leaving red marks on her skin. He lowered his head and kissed her without saying a word. This kiss was more like a young boy's, eager, crazy, and with a kind of rudeness that didn't pity her at all. He clasped her in his arms and did whatever he wanted. He ignored her struggle, and tiny traces of blood appeared in his dark eyes. There was no trace of intimate gentleness. There was only a sense of naked aggression. This kind of shameless invasion bordered on criminal. It was more like he was venting his anger. The youth had been hiding it for too long, and he couldn't suppress the anger that only people of his age would have. Impulsive and reckless. It was even a form of revenge. When the young man felt that the beast in his heart was slightly satisfied, he gently lifted his eyelids, his dark eyes incomparably evil. Then he left her, but his fingers didn't leave the back of her neck. He was practically holding her down, making it impossible for her to escape or even move. Fu Yuheng lowered his eyes and licked the corner of his lips slowly. He looked at the girl's frightened eyes and his thin red lips curled up slightly. His voice was hoarse. The taste of the ice cream is very good. Wei Wei Bai moved her lips before she reacted. Anger appeared in her eyes, and she was about to say something. However, he saw him lower his eyes and reveal an expression that was not a smile. "Brother," he whispered. These two words were spoken with a hint of viciousness. His usual politeness and elegance had disappeared at this moment. Only the vicious side of the young man's heart had emerged. The dark night was beneficial for his cold side to appear. His breathing was still rapid and strong. He lowered his head and leaned over slowly, his thin lips touching the corner of her lips. Little by little, his lips kissed upward. He felt her tremble in fear. "You're so reserved with me, but I don't know how many brothers you've acknowledged outside." // Chapter 3072. His voice was low and hoarse, suppressing a hint of viciousness. "You call me brother so smoothly. So it's because you're used to it." She casually called him brother. In the end, seeing that he didn't take the bait, she directly kicked him away. Then she ran outside to call that wild man brother. To her, could she just casually grab a man and call him big brother? He didn't even have time to figure out what his feelings were. But he knew very well. At first, he liked her cuteness. No matter how calm he was, how much he had seen the world, and how experienced he was. At his current age, he was still full of vigor. He liked a girl's cuteness, even if it didn't involve love. But his desire for her was there. This desire made him want to make a deal with her. But he was rejected. He wasn't angry. For a moment, he even felt that she was naive. He didn't find it strange that a girl of this age was naive. She didn't understand the temptation of wealth. Even if she had a bad mother, she wasn't affected. Maybe she would change in the future. But now, this naivety even made him see her in a new light. He also felt guilty for offending her. After all, he did have a dirty mind towards her. Fu Yuheng's scary kiss came to the corner of her eyes and he felt her eyelashes trembling. He said in a low voice, his voice hoarse. Don't you like to call people brother? Try calling me brother. The fingertips on the back of her neck tightened a little. This was a silent oppression. The girl trembled and her voice weakened. Let go of me, Fu Yuheng. She didn't dare to anger him. Her rough temper was just a paper tiger that knew that he wouldn't be angry. Fu Yuheng didn't spoil her. He said word by word, call me brother. In his threatening tone, there was a faint hint of anger that was about to erupt. Not to mention a little girl, even the group of elders who were older than him. Under his tone, they would tremble. Sure enough, Wei Bai couldn't take it anymore. She bit her lower lip so hard that it turned red. Brother, her voice was almost inaudible. Fu Yuheng smiled. His smile didn't feel noble or elegant at all. Instead, it was an evil aura that made people afraid. He replied lazily, well, since you're going to be my slave and cook. He paused when he saw that she looked like she wanted to run away. He couldn't help but reveal a sinister smile. Then I'll take you in. From now on, you'll do my laundry and, he wanted to say that he was going to cook. But he thought of the exploding egg. Fu Yuheng swallowed his words. He let go of her neck and then pulled open his collar with his fingertips. The buttons were pulled open one by one, revealing his fair skin. Wei Bai leaned against the door and looked at him with a pale face. What are you doing? After Fu Yuheng took off his clothes, his upper body was bare, and he threw the clothes on her head. Wei Bai was stunned. The clothes that covered her head smelled strongly of a young man. She hurriedly tore off her clothes. Fu Yuheng reached out and lifted her chin. His eyes were deep. Stay at home tomorrow. Until I chase you away, you'll stay here. Wei Bai grabbed the clothes tightly and was about to raise her head to resist. But she thought of something and shrank back. She only glared at him with a pair of angry eyes. Fu Yuheng glanced at the clothes in her hands and said coldly, I'll give you a chance to be my slave. Wash the clothes in my hands, /. Chapter 3073. After he finished speaking, his upper body was bare, and his face was as calm as a beast dressed in human clothing. Also, if you want to leave, think about your mother. He paused and enjoyed the girl's panic. Then, he said slowly, during this period of time, she has spent more than $1 million on luxury accessories. If you don't want me to pursue this money or even all her future expenses, then stay here obediently. As he said, it was too easy for this group of people to keep a girl. All kinds of despicable and insidious methods were as simple as drinking water and eating to them. Anyway, if you like, stay. I don't like to let you go. Fu Yuheng's eyes were still dark. He looked at Wei Bai, who was holding his clothes in a daze. He chuckled softly. Do you understand? These words were indescribably frivolous and unrestrained. Once the elegant skin was removed, the beast inside was completely unsightly. He took another step forward and lowered his voice a little. He said threateningly, Do you understand? He had never liked to repeat himself. But he didn't know that at this moment, the power that was above him made him ask one sentence every time. Until she was afraid. The dark and vicious mentality in his heart would be fed a little. Wei Bai grabbed his clothes tightly. Tears came out of her eyes as if she was afraid that he would do something terrible again. She hesitated for a moment before nodding. Only then did Fu Yuheng reveal a gentle smile. He reached out and gently rubbed the top of her head. He enjoyed the smooth and tender feeling of her hair. He said softly, I don't like the color of your hair. Black looks better. It sounded like a suggestion, but it was an order. Wei Bai's eyelashes fluttered. She bit her lower lip and suppressed the urge to refute. Fu Yuheng didn't seem to understand how scary he was. His cold eyes were already dyed with a devilish color. The demon in his heart was out of control. The aggression that had been suppressed for so many years was now aroused by the girl in front of him. He didn't intend to hide it. He had suppressed it for so long, but she didn't appreciate it. Don't blame him for exploding. Fu Yuheng calmly let go of her and even pulled her. Her legs went weak and she stumbled. Then, he pulled her to his single-seater sofa and pressed her down on it with ease. The young man spoke softly, as if he was talking to his beloved child. You must be hungry. Wait for me here obediently. After saying that, he smiled and pulled the clothes back from her hands. He smiled gently. I won't really make you do the laundry and cook. You don't need to do that when you're with me. After all, he had a lover. They should be pampered and raised. If he raised them too crudely, it would be a disgrace to him. Fu Yuheng was very familiar with the way things worked in his circle. But he had never put it into practice. He was too picky. He was a little obsessive-compulsive. Just one look was enough to annoy him. Wei Wei Bai was truly the apple of his eye. Everything about her was exactly what he liked. Except for his personality. Even though he hated her the most at the beginning, the moment he saw her, the first time he saw her, he wanted to plunder her. She was like a clumsy pigeon, flapping her two tiny wings. She kept riding on his head and clucking. She thought that if he wasn't angry and didn't react, she could go even further. Fu Yuheng calmly put on his clothes while looking at Wei Wei Bai, who was curled up on the sofa and looking at him with vigilance and fear. He casually stretched out his fingertips and tugged at his collar, revealing his beautiful neck. His sexy Adam's apple rolled slightly. This was a subtle action that was too seductive. Chapter 3074. But it was caught by the girl in front of him. Her pupils shrank as she tried to shrink back. She almost sank into the sofa and turned into a small ball. Fu Yuheng calmly looked at her before walking out the door. He closed the door and then went downstairs. When he opened the refrigerator in the kitchen, he pursed his lips. When the girl struggled, he bit the skin on his lip. Ding, the male lead's favorability has increased to 30. Then he took out the ingredients that he didn't throw away and began to make supper. For simplicity, he made noodle soup. The clear soup was filled with chopped green onions. The noodles were just right. This was one of the simplest ways to cook. For the youth, it was as simple as boiling an egg. Wei Wei Bai was wiping her mouth. There was no other way, the other's kissing skills were too unsightly. Chicks just couldn't do it, biting and kissing people. She was lucky that he didn't bite her lip until she went bald. The system suddenly yawned. What happened just now? I was suddenly blocked. She was sleeping well when she suddenly heard the sound of blocking and all kinds of blocked messages surrounded her. Although she had already calmed down. But it was still strange, wasn't the host going to sleep? Why was it suddenly blocked? Could it be that the male lead suddenly went wild and rushed into the host's room to do something to her? No, something worse than a beast. In the end, when the block was gone, the host was in the male lead's room. Wei Wei Bai wiped her lower lip and calmly replied, "It's nothing big, it's just that a young man suddenly went crazy and came to take advantage of me." The reason for the increase in favorability was very simple. He was lusting after her. A man's early favorability due to lusting after her was very quick. But to increase it later, it required a beautiful heart-to-heart exchange. 30 favorability was the early increase. The beauty of youth was very simple to make a youth lose control. Then the favorability couldn't be controlled and increased. This had nothing to do with her personality. It was purely because she hadn't seen the world. First love, first time. With such a combination, it was actually quite easy to pull up the favorability. After all, many people's eyes were blind for their first love. Even if he was treated like an ATM, cheated on, or exploited. I still feel that my first love is the best. I just can't bear to give it up. Torture me to death. My first love is my life. When he grew up, he realized that he had been blind back then. He wished he could strangle himself to death for loving his first love. Yes, this is youth. Stupid, easy to give up everything, easy to increase the favorability of youth. Furthermore, Wei Wei Bai touched her face. I feel that after using those beauty products, Fu Yuheng looks at me like a hungry wolf looking at meat. Although she was indeed good-looking. But it seemed that those beauty products would automatically approach Fu Yuheng's aesthetic. Sometimes, if it wasn't a devastatingly beautiful woman, then everyone would like her. After all, people had different aesthetic values. Her appearance seemed to fit Fu Yuheng's aesthetic standards. Otherwise, he would have thrown her out long ago. How could he tolerate her acting like this? In the end, he directly threatened to make her his mistress. TSK, public morals were deteriorating day by day. This child was teachable. To read the full article phone to facilitate your next reading, you can click on. Chapter 3075. The system glanced at the beauty and skincare products it had bought. No, they were all normal skincare products. Other than the good effect and the long time, there were no other problems or advantages. As for the male protagonist being attracted by the host's appearance. Rather than being attracted, it was more like a soul attraction. If this body were to change souls, it would probably have no effect at all. It couldn't be helped. After so many worlds, the Linghu fragment had remembered the host's soul aura. It liked this aura. Even in the face of a severed plane world, without any memories, and even with resentment because of the invasion of foreign souls. It still liked her aura. That was why she always made the male protagonist feel that he had found someone with his aesthetic standards. The host was just asking casually and didn't continue to investigate. The door suddenly opened, and Fu Yuheng walked in with a tray. He put 2 bowls of noodle soup on the table, and then looked at Wei Wei Bai, who was still sitting obediently on the sofa. It had always been a room where he was alone, and the feeling of having another person was actually not that unbearable. He sat on the chair by the table and said to her, "Eat some supper, and then rest well." Wei Wei Bai glared at him, and then looked at the noodles. She looked at him again. Fu Yuheng ignored her, slowly picked up his chopsticks, and then stirred the beef slices on the noodles, mixing them with the noodle soup. Chopped green onions, enough beef slices, and vegetable pieces. Accompanied by noodle soup and noodles. It looked delicious. His voice was low. "If you don't eat, I'll do something else." Wei Wei Bai, Fu Yuheng picked up a piece of beef, drained the soup, and put the beef to her lips. The young man smiled gently. "Eat, be good." These words were filled with a desire to control. Even if it was said in such a gentle tone. Wei Wei Bai was quiet for a while, then her lower lip trembled, and after opening it, she put the beef into her mouth. Fu Yuheng took back the chopsticks and said, "Do you want me to feed you, or do you want to eat yourself?" Wei Wei Bai immediately picked up the bowl and began to eat the noodles. The noodles were especially delicious. Maybe he was hungry. Wei Wei Bai said to the system, "This young man has a bright future. If this continues, he'll probably take out the contract and make a 3-point agreement." This was just one of the steps of keeping a mistress. Of course, this was just a casual joke. After finishing the noodles, Wei Wei Bai wiped her mouth with a tissue. Fu Yuheng walked to the table, took out a piece of paper, and typed on the computer for a while. Then, it was printed out on a small printer. He brought the paper to the table and took out a pen. He said to her, "Take a look and see what else you want to add." Wei Bai looked at him blankly. Then, his gaze fell on the paper. Terms 1, 2, 3, 4 and so on. Of course, there was no such unsightly word as keeping. Instead, he had subtly written the word companion instead. Society, society. She didn't learn anything good, but she was so flirtatious. She immediately blushed and finally couldn't hold it in any longer. She shouted, "Fu Yuheng, you're crazy. You've insulted me enough." As soon as this sentence came out, Fu Yuheng looked up and his eyes became dark and gloomy. "You don't like these terms?" His voice was cold and filled with the ruthlessness of a man as it slowly rang out. He didn't rise and fall, nor did he shout. He didn't even move his body. But that kind of oppressive coldness made people's legs go weak. / save button. Chapter 3076. Although Wei Bai was trembling under his aura, she still resisted with a stiff voice. "You're committing a crime and threatening me. Why can't I see that you're a beast?" Fu Yuheng opened the cap of the fountain pen and wrote some material conditions on the paper slowly and elegantly. "I'll give you an extra shop in a prime location in the city center. Even if you don't know anything in the future, you can rent it out for your living expenses." It was his first time keeping her. He was very generous. If he could use material things to get rid of her, he felt that it was not a problem. These words seemed to provoke Wei Bai's sensitive nerves. She gritted her teeth and sat on the sofa, looking like she was going to run away at any time. Fu Yuheng wrote a few more things. He was meticulously thinking about her living expenses in the future. Of course, she did not have to think about these problems when she was with him. But in the future, his contract with her would end. As long as she did not mess around, her quality of life would still be maintained at a relatively high level. After he finished writing, he turned to the side. Then the youth looked up slightly and saw that her eyes were red. She felt wronged and angry. He was silent for a while before putting the fountain pen in front of her. "Sign your name." Wei Bai finally said with a stiff neck, "You're crazy. How can this thing have legal effect? Even if you force me to sign it, it doesn't count." Fu Yuheng's eyes were dark. He looked at her quietly for a few seconds before saying calmly, "There's no legal effect, so it doesn't matter if you sign or not. I'm giving a notice, not." The last few words were said slowly. But it was full of deterrence. "I'm discussing with you." After saying that, he reached out and grabbed her wrist so tightly that it was frightening. He almost dragged the girl over. Wei Bai immediately retracted. But she found that she could not break free. Fu Yuheng had already turned his face slightly. A trace of coldness appeared on his fair and handsome face. "Do you know what time it is? The quality of the soundproof wall in the house is not bad." This sentence did not have a beginning and end. But she heard his low and magnetic voice. If she did not care about the content of his words, it was very seductive. His voice was heavy. "It's late at night, and there's only you and me at home. You're a girl. If I want to do anything to you, are you sure you can run away?" This was the consequence of her own actions. At first, he let her go. Yet, she came to provoke him and wanted to stick to him every day. She had no concept of the power between men and women. He didn't even seem to care. Under the same room, she really treated him like a eunuch. He didn't covet her. Or, did she think that he was a good person? Fu Yuheng's eyes were slightly cold. His thin lips curved up slightly, revealing a trace of a gentle smile. "You're a good kid. You know how to sign, right?" Wei Wei Bai thought, this black wolf cub is actually a little scary. It was like a rerun of the trilogy of the Ring of the Midnight Bell. Moreover, he was right. It was late at night, and they were both alone. If that lonely man was a psychopath, a murderer, or a sadist, it was indeed a nightmare for a girl. If she wasn't his target, she would have believed that he was a real pervert. Wait a minute, were there any normal people among her targets? Well, there should be a few. She didn't know if she could gather a hand. Wei Wei Bai's hand was held by him, and he stuffed a pen into her hand. Then, she signed her name in a crooked manner. She glanced at the contract. There were a bunch of things on it that were for her. After calculating, she was really worth a lot of money. Then there were the conditions: listen to him, listen to him, listen to him. 3 consecutive words of emphasis. That was all. Fu Yuheng kept the contract. Of course, he knew that there was no legal effect. It was even a little child's play. But when he stuffed the contract into his safe and put it together with the contracts of those major projects, suddenly, he couldn't help but smile as if he had completed the most important transaction in his life. The voice of the girl behind him was a little scared. She whispered, "Can I go now? I'm going to sleep." Fu Yuheng locked the safe. When he heard this sentence, he paused. He turned back and looked at her with deep eyes for a while before saying in a gentle voice, "Listen to me. Tonight, your bed will be in my room." By Wei Wei. At the /crossover system, Adonis, come here and read the full article at https://www. Sashu. Com. Download the read the full text. 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 Chapter 3077. A man and a woman shared the same bed in the same room. She thought that the teenage version of the overbearing CEO falling in love with the forceful lover would be accelerated. In the end, Wei Wei Bai rolled off the bed. She was pushed down. She looked at the lights with a dumbfounded expression. Yes, she just found out about Fu Yuheng's D*MN bad habit. He didn't turn off the lights when he slept. This was a taboo for beauty. When the melatonin looked at the lights, it would think that it was daytime and would not be secreted. It would affect her beauty sleep. It was one of the necessary conditions for the formation of dark circles. The back of her head hurt a little. Fortunately, the bed was low and there was a carpet around the bed. Otherwise, after being pushed off the bed 3 times, she would probably have a concussion now. She reached out and grabbed the side of the bed. Her thick hair stood up and her eyes were filled with sleepiness. Then, she looked at the young man on the bed. Fu Yuheng had already opened his eyes. His eyelashes were slightly lowered, and he looked a little confused. His eyes had lost their usual coldness and clarity. Instead, there was a hint of confusion. At this moment, he had no attack power. If he hadn't pushed her off the bed, Wei Wei Bai would have believed that he was harmless. She pursed her lips and was about to say something. Fu Yuheng was already frowning. He got up, grabbed her arm, and pulled her onto the bed. Then, he didn't believe it and pulled her into his arms. He pulled the blanket and wrapped the two of them up. The tip of his nose rubbed against the girl's soft skin. He paused slightly but didn't take another step. Instead, he looked down calmly and whispered, "Sleep." It was only 3:00. Yes, they had only been in bed for 2 hours. Wei Wei Bai had been pushed off the bed 3 times by him. Every time she fell asleep, there would be a bang. Bai Weiwei always had a face. In the end, Fu Yuheng woke up when he heard the noise and pulled her onto the bed again, continuing to hug her to sleep. It was as if he felt that it would be a loss if he didn't take advantage of her after giving her so much. But it wasn't good to take advantage of her. Weiwei Bai glared at him. The young man lowered his eyes and met her gaze. He was silent for a while before he reached out his fair and slender fingers and pressed her eyes. Like closing the eyes of a person who had died with grievances, he asked her to close her eyes. His voice was hoarse. If you don't want to sleep, do something else. Weiwei Bai closed her eyes and snorted, every time you want to sleep, you push me down. I'm not dead, how can I fall asleep? Why don't we let each other go? I'm going back to my room. Fu Yuheng tugged at the blanket and leaned against the pillow with a calm expression. He reached out to stroke her long hair. Soft, beautiful honey color. It was exceptionally good-looking. His aesthetic sense was more traditional. Even if he didn't like her dyed blonde hair, he still felt that she was the most beautiful one. His fingertips slowly twirled her hair in a very childish manner. It was like an explanation. His voice rang out slowly. You'll get used to it. He was very vigilant and had always slept alone since he was young. They were also very territorial. It didn't matter when there was another person on the bed when he woke up. He liked her soft sweetness very much. Even though the way he hugged her was a little unfamiliar, he still felt that it was gentle and cute. But once he fell asleep, his territorial sense was instinctively awakened. Once he found something beside him, he would instinctively reach out and push it away. Weiwei Bai heard this sentence and the corners of her mouth twitched. But she didn't open her eyes. Instead, she pursed her lips and continued to cultivate her sleepiness. Fu Yuheng saw that she didn't resist and heaved a sigh of relief, //. To facilitate your next reading, you can click on Chapter 3078. Although he understood the procedures of keeping women. But, this was the first time he had done this kind of business. There were many unfamiliar areas that made him feel at a loss. However, no matter how flustered he would not show it in the slightest. Fu Yuheng clumsily loosened the long hair on his fingers. Just now, he was rolling it for fun, but now it was tied into a dead knot by his actions. This was too stupid. He was afraid that she would find out that he had done something stupid. The young man half closed his eyes and observed if she opened them. Then, slowly, he used a difficult position to untie the dead knot on her hair. She was curled up in his arms, so this action was difficult. Suddenly, the girl in his arms moved. His fingers stiffened a little. She moved a little, but didn't open her eyes. Her breathing became steady. She fell asleep. The girl's face was leaning on his arm. Her delicate cheeks were a little distorted, and there were traces of light under her eyelashes. She was as clean and delicious as a peach. The red and soft kind. Fu Yuheng looked at her silently for a while. Then, he pursed his lips, feeling a little dry. He used a long time to untie the dead knot. Suddenly, he couldn't sleep. Under the dim yellow light, the soft girl lay in his arms. He found that it was a little difficult to suppress himself. Of course, he didn't touch her. After all, he was too anxious. He didn't make a move on her immediately. If her resistance was stronger, this business couldn't be done. Fu Yuheng's mind was full of business experience. But it was obvious that these experiences couldn't calm him down much. The night was dark, and time passed little by little. He didn't push her off the bed because he wasn't asleep at all. The gentle girl's breath kept talking to him. When he came back to his senses, he would be a eunuch if he could sleep. So, Fu Yuheng opened his eyes and stared at Wei Wei Bai for a long time. She wasn't boring at all, and she was really good-looking. Many people, no matter how beautiful they were, might have some impression of them at first glance, but he was tired of them after the second or third time. But she didn't seem to have any aesthetic blind spots. Fu Yuheng slowly reached out his hand and gently pinched her chin. Then, he adjusted her face and looked at her. The soft and innocent feeling, like a little angel. She looked so cute when she was asleep. Cute was a word that he would occasionally come across when he surfed the internet. Especially when an employee had a cat, he actually shouted that his cat was cute. Fu Yuheng turned her face to the side and saw that her eyelashes were very long, very dense, and very black. The lines at the ends of his eyes were gentle. Usually, when she glared at him, she didn't feel that he was very powerful. Perhaps it was because her eyes were too beautiful and soft. He seemed to be bewitched. He lowered his head and kissed the corner of her eye. Her eyelashes brushed past her lips, making them itchy. Then, he came back to his senses and realized how gentle his actions were. His heart stirred. He didn't seem to know where his gentleness came from. Fu Yuheng didn't really care. He continued to hug her and stared blankly. It was as if he was hugging a precious item that he had longed for a long time and finally got his hands on. He was actually so excited that he couldn't sleep. Ding, the male lead's favorability is at 35. Just a pure sleep and he could actually get 5 points of favorable impression. When Wei Wei Bai woke up, she stared at the numbers and felt that Brother Fu was too pure. Although he was wearing the skin of a domineering CEO, he had never been in a relationship before. Sigh, a precious panda who had never been in a relationship. He even fiercely learned how to be domineering. Chapter 3079. It was simply silly and adorable. It wasn't fun to keep someone who was too pure. What about imprisonment? What about bondage? What was strong about it? Breaking their legs if they ran. What about torturing them when they were caught? There was nothing. Okay, please turn on the green, pollution-free, super pure version of the children's channel. Watch the children's program about how the domineering and pure president didn't dare to do it. Wei Wei Bai sighed. It's still not perverted enough. She felt fragrant and spicy. Without the spiciness, it was not satisfying at all. The system's big hat was still half done. He hooked the lines and knitted little flowers for the hat while saying, "Isn't this easier to conquer?" After all, perverted body abuse is very troublesome. Thinking back to those big perverts who abused her so easily in the past. It was still easier to fool the pure boy's pure-keeping contract now. Wei Wei Bai felt that it was boring and not tasty enough. But it was just a casual remark. After all, the work was simple and there was no challenge. Just treat it as a vacation. When Wei Wei Bai woke up, it was already 9 o'clock. To her, this was a normal time to wake up. After all, she slept too late last night. But Fu Yuheng woke up at 6 o'clock, had a simple breakfast, and went to work. She glanced at Fu Yuheng's work status. It felt like the Demon King program had been activated. Everyone was in the palm of his hand, and all the projects were pushed forward by him. Awesome was awesome, but it was very tiring. Wei Wei Bai looked at it a few times and was not interested in his work status. When she went downstairs, the nanny who was cooking was still there. The 2 nannies who came to clean were tidying up the house. When they saw her, they were stunned for a moment. Then, they thought of something and shouted in unison. "Miss, you're awake." "Miss?" Wei Wei Bai stopped in her tracks and looked at them in confusion. The nanny just smiled politely and then walked upstairs with the cleaning tools. One of the nannies said politely, "In the room on the second floor, we've already packed your luggage and put it back." It was obvious that Fu Yuheng had asked them to say this. Wei Wei Bai just narrowed her eyes at them and didn't say anything. The nanny who was cooking also came out. He smiled at her and said, "Miss, breakfast is ready. Do you want to eat at the dining table or move to the courtyard or the balcony? The weather is good today." Oh. He was so polite that even Wei Wei Bai felt embarrassed. Wei Wei Bai took a step back warily and said coldly, "I'm not eating. I have an appointment with someone. We'll eat outside." With that, she walked straight to the door. No one stopped her. It was as if she was the master of the family, and everyone was revolving around her. After she opened the door and left, the nanny immediately called her. When the call was picked up, it was a transfer notification. She said something about Wei Wei Bai. Not long after, a deep and pleasant voice came from the other side of the phone. "She didn't eat breakfast." The nanny said, "No, he said he had an appointment with someone to eat outside." "You have an appointment?" The young man chuckled in a low voice. For some reason, the nanny felt a chill run down her spine. Wei Wei Bai was having breakfast in a roadside shop. She had brought her wallet with her. She didn't want to run. If she ran, the quality would drop, and the strategy would be difficult. But it wouldn't suit her character if she didn't run, so she planned to walk around first. After the meal, she went shopping. She just went for a stroll. After all, her wallet wasn't thick enough, so she didn't dare to spend casually. There was air conditioning in the mall, so she stayed in the mall and looked around casually. Chapter 3080. She saw that the dress was all right, but it was a little expensive. Wei Wei Bai reached out to touch it. The material was passable. At her age, it was not suitable for her to be so mature and gorgeous. Pure and cute was her style. Hence, she just took a look. After reading it, she calmly ate her ice cream and walked back. In this weather, it was more comfortable in the mall. She would get heatstroke if she stayed outside for too long. She had just finished her ice cream when she heard her phone ring. The male lead was here to rush her. Wei Wei Bai picked up the phone. "Bai Xiaoyu." She picked up the phone and heard Bai Xiaoyu's soft voice. "Wei Wei, your brother wants you to come home for dinner. Why are you still outside so late at night? It's dangerous for a girl like you to go home." Wei Wei Bai listened to this voice. It was so soft that even women would feel weak in the knees. It was no wonder that she had done so well in the social circle when she was young. Now that she was middle-aged, she could even make Fu Yuheng's father fall for her. She raised her eyebrows and remained silent for a while before saying, "Mom, can I move out on my own?" she said as she walked out. He looked as if he had lost his soul. Bai Xiaoyu was anxious. "Why are you not listening? Just go back when I ask you to. Do you know that Fu Yuheng is the one who controls the Fu family? If you don't listen to him, he will cut off your Uncle Fu's source of income. That would be killing him." Wei Wei Bai had already walked out of the mall. She stopped by the roadside, lowered her head, and pursed her lips. Finally, she said softly, "But Fu Yuheng," Bai Xiaoyu said in a low voice, "he can do whatever he wants. If you follow him, you will be helping me too." Wei Wei Bai suddenly suppressed her voice. "Do you think I'm a prostitute?" Bai Xiaoyu immediately said, "How can you talk to me like that? If you are obedient, I will just die. If you want me to go back to the way I was before, I would rather not live." Wei Wei Bai, she clutched her phone tightly. Suddenly, she choked and said, "I'll go back." Bai Xiaoyu heaved a sigh of relief. "That's good. Listen to your brother in the future. Don't run out alone." Before he could finish speaking, she heard Wei Wei Bai's voice slowly ring out. You really don't know what Fu Yuheng wants me to do. Bai Xiaoyu was taken aback. Then, she smiled awkwardly and changed the topic. Your Uncle Fu is calling me. Remember to go home. The call ended. Wei Wei Bai stood by the side of the road and remained in a daze. She blinked. Suddenly, her eyes turned red as if she had lost all her strength. She slowly squatted down and held her forehead with her hand. It was as if he wanted to cry, but he couldn't. Through the half-opened rear window of the black car parked at the side, the young man stared at her coldly. The girl seemed to have been abandoned by the whole world. Her lonely and slender back was bent, and her helpless appearance was simply like a small animal with nowhere to go. Furthermore, he was injured and looked so weak that he couldn't even withstand a single blow. He lowered his eyes, concealing the strange ripple that flashed through his eyes. Then he opened the car door and walked in front of her. He bent down and reached out as if he wanted to touch her head. He hesitated for a moment and paused in midair. Then, he said in a low voice, "Let's go back. It's very late." She had been wandering outside for the entire day, and he had followed her for the entire day. He saw her eating at roadside stalls, buying ice cream, and going to the game store to play games. She even went to the amusement park to ride the wooden horse. She looked so childish. Her rebelliousness seemed to be just a clumsy cover. On the inside, she still had a weird temper and looked like an obedient child. She didn't even dare to go shopping. Fu Yuheng was distracted and his fingers were slapped away. Wei Wei Bai lowered her head and didn't look at him. She said coldly, "Are you satisfied, bastard?" Chapter 3081. Fu Yuheng wasn't angry. He looked at the back of his hand that was red. Then, he reached out again and clasped her fingers tightly. His fingertips passed through the gaps between her fingers and held them tightly. Then, he pulled her up and walked towards the car. Wei Wei Bai stumbled as she followed. Her eyes were red, but she stubbornly refused to cry. When Fu Yuheng opened the car door, he saw her pitiful look through the window and paused. He still opened the door and stuffed her into the car. When the driver started to drive, Wei Wei Bai sat and leaned against the window on the other side. She didn't look at him. Fu Yuheng's face was indifferent. The two of them seemed to be staring at each other nervously. The air was so stiff that it was suffocating. Suddenly, the car turned a corner. A force of inertia caused Wei Wei Bai's body to sway. However, this force of inertia wasn't enough to make her fall. She just tilted her body towards Fu Yuheng. In the next moment, she was about to adjust her body's posture so that she wouldn't lean over. Suddenly, a hand with slender and fair fingers clasped her shoulder. It took a while for her body to be brought over. Wei Wei Bai was stunned. Her entire body was leaning against Fu Yuheng. Although it was summer, the young man's breath was exceptionally clear and beautiful. It was especially comfortable. Wei Wei Bai narrowed her eyes. If it wasn't for the character setting, she would have hugged him. After all, in this kind of weather, even if there was an air conditioner in the car, it was also uncomfortable. She pursed her lips and was about to leave with a frown. However, a hand calmly pressed the back of her head and pressed her against his chest. The young man's heart was beating a little fast. However, he looked very normal. He didn't feel nervous at all. Wei Wei Bai's eyelashes fluttered. She gritted her teeth and said coldly, "Let go." Fu Yuheng was silent for a while. There was a hint of frustration in his exquisite eyes. He hesitated for a moment. Then, he said hesitantly, "You can cry it out." This sentence seemed to be a little awkward for him. It was as if he had never comforted anyone like this before. Wei Wei Bai's body trembled. Her face was pressed against his chest, but she didn't make a sound. But there were no tears. She was held down by him just like that. He seemed to be very sad. Fu Yuheng looked down and saw that her slender back was trembling slightly as if it was bearing something unbearable. His eyelashes were lowered, and his breathing was heavy. He seemed to be able to sense her helplessness and discomfort. He knew what Bai Xiaoyu would say. He also knew that she would listen. Therefore, calling Bai Xiaoyu to ask her to come back was the best way. But for some reason, when he saw her squatting down weakly by the side of the road, looking so lonely that it made his heart ache. For a moment, he regretted letting Bai Xiaoyu do this. After all, she was a girl who kept calling for her mother when she was sick. The more you value your mother's love, the more painful it will be when you are betrayed. Fu Yuheng's fingers couldn't help but gently pat her back. He could feel the thin and beautiful lines of her back under her clothes. Only then did he realize how thin and weak she was. Suddenly, he heard Wei Wei Bai mutter, "Are you done?" Fu Yuheng paused. He didn't quite understand her words. But he heard the girl in front of his chest say word by word, "Are you done touching? Can I leave now?" These two questions. Instantly, the young man's face was dyed with an imperceptible blush. Only then did he realize how ambiguous his actions were, how much it seemed like molestation. He comforted her into a hooligan. Chapter 3082. Fu Yuheng immediately retracted his finger. After a moment of silence, as if to hide his slight awkwardness, he said in a low voice, "That's enough." Wei Wei Bai immediately left his embrace and retreated to the other side of the car. There was a large gap in between their seats. Fu Yuheng looked at the gap in the middle of the seats and pursed his lips, not saying anything. Then he casually looked up and saw Wei Wei Bai's shadow looking at the car window. She seemed to be careless as she casually wiped her face with her fingers. But he saw the tears falling from her face. Fu Yuheng didn't say a word and didn't try to comfort her again. Perhaps in her eyes, he was the worst person in the world right now. So no matter what he did, she would reject it. Fu Yuheng gently clenched his fingers and put them on his lap, not saying a word. Wei Wei Bai heard the notification sound of the favorability. Ding, the male lead's favorability is at 40. Wei Wei Bai wiped the tears that came out because she wanted to sleep. Sigh, this was the favorability brought by guilt. A tender young boy, really pure. Back at home, Bai Wei Wei was listless and spiritless. Even a head of honey-colored hair couldn't bring a trace of life to her pale face. She said tiredly, "Do you still need to go to your room tonight?" Fu Yuheng was taking off his coat when he heard this. He was stunned. Then he turned his face and said calmly, "You can come if you want, this isn't forced." "If you want to rest, I also," when he said the last few words. He was still a bit unfamiliar. "It's not forced." After all, the two of them had this kind of relationship, so to Yuheng. He had to be careful in all of his conversations. He was afraid that if he said too much, it would hurt the girl's self-esteem. This was the first time he had so much to worry about when he spoke. Bai Wei Wei didn't say anything and went straight upstairs. She didn't look back once. The youth standing by the clothes rack had an indifferent expression. His fingers gripped his clothes, but he didn't say anything. Then he followed her upstairs. After Fu Yuheng returned to his room, his phone rang. He took a look. It was Old Master. After the call was connected, the old man's voice was extremely calm. "A few of the people you forced to retire recently are restless. They have already hooked up with those who haven't retired yet. You have to be careful." Fu Yuheng stood by the table, picked up a fountain pen, and casually drew a relationship diagram on the A4 white paper. "Don't worry, I'll keep an eye on them. When the time comes, we'll catch them all in one fell swoop." Old Master Shen was more experienced. "Be careful. They're cornered." His grandson's methods were too ruthless. He didn't leave any leeway for them. This could easily lead to a counterattack. Fu Yuheng said calmly, "The company has given them enough benefits. If they live well, they won't have to worry about the rest of their lives. I've given them too much, which is why they have such an unbalanced mentality. Humans are greedy. If he gave too much and took back some, it would cause an imbalance in people's hearts. So what? If he dared to continue, his hand would be broken." His gaze turned cold and ruthless. His originally irritable mood was now even more difficult to suppress. "Wait for them to cooperate. I'll wipe them all out again." Old Master Shen laughed when he heard this. "Why are you suddenly so angry? Aren't you always calm? But this is the right feeling. How old are you? Don't be so lethargic." What was Old Master Shen saying? Fu Yuheng didn't hear him clearly. // Chapter 3083. Because there was an impatient knocking sound outside the door. The rhythm of this sound was Wei Wei Bai's. Fu Yuheng hung up the phone immediately. The old man's words became a background noise that he kicked away. Then he turned around and walked quickly to the door, about to open it immediately. But he realized that he was too anxious. The young man stood by the door, his breathing a little messy. Only then did he realize that he was indeed very anxious. He pursed his lips and suppressed his breathing. Then he reached out and opened the door. Then his pupils constricted. He saw the girl standing outside in a little tank top and shorts, hugging a pillow with a cold expression. The little tank top was really too revealing. Only the part that covered her chest, her fair and tender stomach, and her delicate and round shoulders and collarbones were exposed. The shorts she was wearing made her fair legs look even more long and slender. The girl was beautiful, clean, and simply exuded a maddening seductiveness. Fu Yuheng stared blankly for a moment before he kept calm and asked, "What's the matter?" Wei Wei Bai rolled her eyes at him coldly and said with a sneer, "I'm here to warm your bed, in case you call my mom again and make her unable to live." This sentence made the young man not know how to refute for a moment. After all, Bai Xiaoyu was indeed under his orders. That was why he asked her to come back. He didn't do it properly. He knew very well. Wei Wei Bai could not be bothered to look at him at all. She immediately squeezed past him, hugged the pillow, and walked to the sofa. She sat on the sofa familiarly. She hugged the pillow and leaned against the sofa. Under the sparkling white light, a large part of her back was exposed. Fu Yuheng closed the door and was about to say something when he suddenly paused. Only then did he realize that the front of the tank top was still conservative. The girl's back was only tied with 2 straps. Across the middle of her back, the light red straps were tied into a bow in the middle of her back. Because it was too long, the bow straps dangled under her back and were on the verge of falling off. The thin red straps were flawless on her fair back. They complemented each other. There was a kind of crazy and exciting beauty. She turned around, her long hair draping over her shoulders. The young girl's eyelashes were long and drooping. Under her eyelashes, her beautiful eyes gave off a mesmerizing feeling. A simple glance back. It was a seduction of a stunning beauty. Fu Yuheng's dark eyes deepened. He didn't even move an inch as he stood there in a daze. Wei Wei Bai had no idea what kind of impact it had on him. Instead, he turned his head indifferently and said lazily, "I'm selling it to you anyway." You can do whatever you want with it. After saying that, she laughed at herself. After all, you offered a really high price, didn't you? As she spoke, she rested her chin on her hand and sneered. I don't know what's wrong with you. Your father is with my mother, but you insist on being with me. What's wrong with you? Wei Wei Bai muttered to herself as she spoke. Damn pervert. Trash. Doing these things at such a young age, you will die a horrible death. These words were muttered, as if they thought that no one could hear them clearly. In a fit of pique, they didn't look like they were here to warm the bed. Instead, they looked more like they were here to anger people to death. Suddenly, Wei Wei Bai frowned as something brushed past the back of her neck. Was it the sound of breathing? She didn't have time to figure it out. A soft kiss had already landed on the back of her neck. It was a light kiss, but it was too sudden and unbelievable. Wei Wei Bai's eyelashes fluttered, and she almost reflexively reached out to press the back of her neck. Chapter 3084. The young man behind her had already left. He walked away with a calm expression. That kiss just now had some kind of indescribable morbidity. It was as if it had never existed. Wei Wei Bai turned around and stared at him in disbelief. What are you doing? Fu Yuhing came to his desk, opened his notebook, and looked at her calmly. I need to deal with some work before bed. You can go to bed first to warm up. This sentence was frivolous, but he said it seriously. It didn't seem wretched at all. Wei Wei Bai's fingers were already pressing the back of her neck, as if she was a little surprised that his reaction was so normal. That kiss just now was like a butterfly's wings flapping. It was over in an instant. It didn't seem real. So she pursed her lips, thinking that she was making a fuss over nothing. The girl released her fingers and smiled rebelliously. Let's talk about it when you're in bed. I'm bored waiting on the bed by myself. Fu Yuhing didn't say anything, but turned around and casually pulled out a book from his bookshelf. Then he reached out and threw the book on the table in front of her sofa. Read it if you're bored. Wei Wei Bai raised her eyebrows and glanced at the cover. It seemed to be a textbook. Fu Yuhing had already sat down and started typing. School is about to start. Prepare for the first-year books. Wei Wei Bai frowned. Fu Yuhing said softly, listen to me. Wei Wei Bai, then she picked up the book and flipped through it with a tense face. She flipped through the pages noisily. She was completely distracted. Fu Yuhing was not affected at all. About 10 minutes later, he suddenly heard the girl throw the book on the table. I don't understand. Fu Yuheng looked up at her. He was already wearing glasses, and his usually cold and dark eyes were separated by the lenses of his glasses. He actually looked much more refined. His voice was faint. How can you keep up with learning if you don't understand? Didn't you want me to find you a good university? The students in the university are all good. You can't compete with others. The girl smiled indifferently and then said self-deprecatingly, do I still need to compete with others? I'm already a kept woman. Hearing this, it was a feeling of defiance. Of course, Fu Yuheng understood her mentality. Because he was abandoned by his mother, he gave up on himself. However, she was stubborn and couldn't stand being manipulated and kept by him. Therefore, the rebellious phase became more serious. With this kind of temperament, he would become honest after being thrown into society for a few years. Fu Yuheng glanced sideways at her. The beautiful girl furrowed her delicate brows and glared at the books on the table. Her features were beautiful. Even when she was angry, there was a kind of pure and lovely beauty that was full of vitality. She was a very delicate flower. The thought flashed through his mind. Flowers couldn't withstand any kind of destruction. Why did he want her to sharpen herself? Fu Yuheng realized that he couldn't stand her leaving him. Become a member of the mediocre crowd, and then conform to social conventions, get married and have children. She just had to leave him. Her life was worlds apart from his. The barrier between them was simply insurmountable. Even if they met again in the future, he didn't know what she would become. Become ugly, become old, or become unbearably vulgar. This was not a random thought. It was a real idea formed after seeing too many examples. Fu Yuheng knew that it was a very extravagant thing to let a girl maintain her beauty. She was now in puberty, so her best years were in these few years. If she didn't take good care of it, she would wither. Wei Bai didn't know what was going on in Fu Yuheng's mind. If she knew, she would slap him. You're the one who's withered. Your whole family is withered. He was cursing her to become ugly. Of course, she didn't know. She just felt that the young man's gaze was a little strange or even sentimental. Sigh, why was this kept dawdling? Couldn't he be more direct, more violent, and more aggressive? Thinking of this, she coldly rolled her eyes at him. It was a sincere and unfake look of mockery. Address of the full text, https://www.sashu.com. Download of the full text, https://www.sashu.com//t. Chapter 3085. After Fu Yuheng finished his work, he had a 10-minute remote summary meeting. After turning off the computer, he realized that Wei Bai had fallen asleep. She hugged a pillow and leaned against the wide single-seater sofa. She tilted her head and rubbed the armrest of the sofa, sleeping with her eyes closed. There was a red mark on her delicate cheeks from the pressure of the sofa's armrest. The young man looked at her calmly for a while before getting up. Then, he went to get a blanket and carefully covered her body. After he was done, he went to the bathroom to take a shower. When taking a shower, a young man of his age was inevitably impatient. Even if his recent work had consumed more than half of his energy, he couldn't suppress the imagination that was aroused by the girl. This feeling was very foreign to him. Instead, he didn't know what to do to suppress it for a while. Fu Yuheng took a cold shower and looked at the mirror with steam all over his body. In the steamy mirror, he could vaguely see a hot blush on his face. If it wasn't for the cold shower, he could say that the temperature on his skin was brought by the hot water and not him. Recently, his self-control was practically running away. Fu Yuheng laughed at himself. Then, he casually put on his pajamas and walked out. The coldness of the air conditioner finally took away a wave of heat from his cold skin. He calmly walked to the sofa and bent down to pick up the girl. The blanket wasn't covered properly and slipped to the ground. The young man's slender fingers also touched the girl's smooth and tender back skin. He held her and stood there for a long time. He didn't know if he was in a daze or feeling the tenderness of the girl in his arms. It wasn't easy for him to come back to his senses. Then, he carried her to the bed. Wei Bai lay on the bed and turned over. She reached out to hug the blanket and slept in a baby's curled-up position. Fu Yuheng stood by the bed and saw her cute sleeping posture. An analysis flashed through his mind. It was said that people who slept in this position were insecure. The young man stared at her quietly for a long time before lying down on the bed. He lay flat on his back. Wei Bai curled up on the other side and slept. There was a gap between them. Fu Yuheng squinted at the light. The girl beside him was still in that insecure posture, not moving at all. It seemed like he could sleep in this position for the entire night. The young man turned his head to look at her. He saw her smooth back and her black hair casually draped over the pillow. Her slender neck and the contours of her face were exceptionally beautiful. He looked at it for a while, then calmly looked away. There was a moment of silence. He couldn't help but stretch out his hand, but halfway through, he retracted his finger. Then, he crossed his hands and placed them behind his head as a pillow. He was used to being calm and collected. A moment of wandering thoughts was too fresh for him. He was even a little perplexed. These emotional fluctuations could be, or perhaps, physical problems. For Fu Yuheng, there was no reason for him to lose control of his physiological self-control. He stared at the light for a long time. Suddenly, he felt the person beside him turn over. She didn't flip to his side immediately, but she casually placed her fingers. She placed it on his waist, a little lower. He was stunned for a moment. His body stiffened, but he did not move, nor did he remove her fingers. Just like that, there was a deadlock. Time passed by minute by minute. Fu Yuheng's pillow movements were a little numb, and his fingers began to feel numb like needles. He frowned. He moved his hand away from the back of his head, then turned sideways as if he had accepted his fate. He reached out and held the hand that she placed on his body. Slash. Chapter 3086. With this strength, her entire body was already in his arms. Fu Yuheng didn't really do anything. He just hugged her. The soft and fragrant scent of a young girl in the summer room. It was unusually delicious and comfortable. Her skin was slightly cold. The temperature of the air conditioner, coupled with her clothes, was almost equivalent to not wearing anything, so her skin was cool and comfortable to the touch. Fu Yuheng touched it for a while before he realized that his actions were too wretched. He stopped his actions. He looked away with an innocent face. After looking for a while, the feeling of sleepiness finally came. He narrowed his eyes and slowly closed them. Suddenly, the girl in his arms turned over again and rolled away from his arms. He instinctively reached out to pull her back. However, his fingertips seemed to have touched something and pulled. It was released. Fu Yuheng paused and opened his eyes. He saw that the only part of the girl's short singlet that was connected to the belt was torn open. As for the short vest, it also fell to the ground. The girl's back was facing him. Really, there was no cover. He stared at her back and pursed his lips. Suddenly, he felt that the feeling of sleepiness disappeared again. The girl didn't turn over again. Her curled-up posture was unusually cute. But it was so seductive that it was unbearable. Her skin was so good that there were no flaws. Fu Yuheng stared at it for a long time, but he couldn't find anything wrong with it. In the end, he reached out to cover his eyes, rubbed his temples, and muttered in a low voice. Damn it. At this time, he showed the helplessness of a teenager. Although they had signed a contract. But he wasn't a real human trafficker. And his education since he was young didn't teach him to bully women. The law of the jungle was used in the same business circle. The girl was just a little rabbit who accidentally entered his territory. He used tricks on her. In fact, he was no longer a gentleman. So he wanted to do whatever he wanted to her. For a moment, he didn't know how to do it. And he was a little inexperienced with these things. He usually wouldn't move if he didn't have a plan for things that were too inexperienced. But if he didn't move at this time, it would really kill him. Fu Yuheng endured for a while before pulling the blanket over and covering that petite and seductive body. Then, he slowly moved closer and felt the warmth of the girl's back. He reached out and carefully placed his hand on her leg. The skin that his fingertips touched was delicate and soft. Just like that, he hugged her quietly. He was tormented to the point that he did not have a good rest the entire night. When Wei Wei Bai woke up, the young man had already run away. She was the only one left in the bed. She was still covered with a blanket, but her little singlet was folded neatly and placed on the pillow beside her. Yes, it was on Fu Yuheng's pillow. Wei Wei Bai looked up at the small singlet and was speechless. Then, he looked at the favorability. The male lead's favorability is at 45. The favorability was purely based on her appearance. Wei Wei Bai rubbed her chin speechlessly. Yep, youths are indeed passionate. Basically, they didn't do anything. Then, it automatically added the favorability points. Maybe it was because he felt embarrassed not to give her favorable impression after seeing her naked. Sure enough, under the burning eaves of dry firewood, a man and a woman, even if they didn't do anything, they would still have a good impression of each other. Furthermore, it was summer. It was very hot. Just like that, Wei Wei Bai was afraid that this young man would not be able to hold it in and explode in the future. Just like that, he would hold it in until he became a useless turtle. Chapter 3087. It was fine as long as the favorability didn't drop. Fu Yuheng had really become a tortoise spirit. That was his problem. Wei Wei Bai dragged the blanket back to her room to change her clothes. As for the little suspender, she would treat it as a gift for Fu Yuheng with 5 points of favorability. Life went on as usual, day by day. Wei Wei Bai wore all kinds of sexy youthful clothes every day and reported to Fu Yuheng's door every night. Fu Yuheng didn't say anything. But she went too much. The young man started to take out his middle school textbooks and started to tutor her. Of course, her grades were terrible because of her delinquent character. In the beginning, he wanted to teach her university. But when he checked, she probably didn't even graduate from primary school. If she didn't know how to write her name. Fu Yuheng even suspected that she was illiterate. It was just that she was impatient to learn in middle school. In the end, she was impatient and just tore the books and threw them into the trash can. She looked at him angrily. Why? Do you think my education level is not high enough for you? Does your mistress still have to study for a doctorate? You don't make a woman memorize math equations when you're with her, do you? Fu Yuheng reached out and rubbed the middle of his nose. Maybe he felt that teaching a primary school student, it was very difficult. Then he reached out to hold her hand and pulled her into his embrace. He lowered his head and covered her mouth. A long kiss almost suffocated Wei Wei Bai to death. Fu Yuheng kissed her and said softly, "If you don't like to study, we'll learn this." He was speaking too seriously. His deep, dark eyes were filled with burning sparks. The seemingly calm young man seemed to be on the edge. He couldn't hold it in anymore. He wanted to find a reason to do evil to her. Delinquent girl, coward Wei Wei immediately picked up her pen and muttered unhappily, "Just learn. What's so difficult about it?" Fu Yuheng looked at her slowly and pursed his lips. His expression seemed to be a pity that she was so cowardly. He hugged her to sleep every day. He was used to hugging her. There wouldn't be an embarrassing thing like pushing her off the bed. A beautiful bookshelf, a single man and a single woman, under a cute roof. They were in the same room and were studying hard. This kind of life, Fu Yuheng thought that he would be bored after a long time. But for some reason, he saw a girl walking around him every day. Like a stray cat. From time to time, she would scratch him a few times. It brought slight pain. However, he didn't feel uncomfortable at all. There was even a certain feeling in his heart that was faintly stirring. Fu Yuheng was not stupid. He roughly knew what kind of feeling she had. Just because he hadn't experienced it didn't mean that he didn't know what his feelings were. The contract was placed there. But he didn't feel like she had to obey him at all. He just let her accompany him. Just don't run away. His first love, Tranquility, Ninja King, was still slowly dealing with his restless feelings. Fu Yuhing came back late because he had to deal with a few radical old employees. A trace of fatigue appeared on his face. He took off his clothes and went to take a bath. After taking a shower, he habitually took out his teaching materials. This was the learning summary that he had written during the break in the meeting today. It was for Wei Wei Bai's revision. She just didn't like to study, but she wasn't stupid. She still had some talent in learning. She probably wouldn't be able to catch up in the first year of university. But if he were to revise for her later on, she would probably be able to catch up in the second year. Looking at the time, Fu Yuhing realized that she should be here. Because Wei Wei Bai came around the same time every time, they didn't make an appointment. // Chapter 3088. But there was a tacit understanding. But this time, a long time had passed. But there was no rough knocking on the door. Fu Yuhing frowned. Was she not at home? No, if she did not come back, the nanny at home would inform him. Fu Yuhing hesitated for a while before opening the door and walking out. When he reached the second floor, he knocked on the door. There was no response. Fu Yuhing's eyes turned cold. Did she really go out? It was so late. Where was she going? He touched the door handle and found that it was not locked. He pushed the door open without hesitation. In the end, he saw a bulge on the bed in the room. He walked over and found that Wei Wei Bai was curled up in a ball, sleeping with her eyes closed. Her face was pale and her forehead was covered in sweat. She seemed to be in pain. Fu Yuhing frowned and immediately touched her face. He found that her skin was a little cold. Did she catch a cold? He called out softly, Wei Wei. Wei Wei Bai opened her eyes immediately and glared at him impatiently. I can't serve you today. Get lost. Fu Yuhing was stunned by this irritable tone that sounded like a dinosaur spitting fire. Then he said softly, You're sick. I'll call the family doctor. Wei Wei Bai looked irritated. She turned around and continued hugging the blanket. Is there a need for a doctor when it's my period? It'll be over soon. Her period. Even though Fu Yuhing was smart, he was stunned for 3 seconds before he came back to his senses. Girls who were on their period had different hormone levels. That was why their temper was especially volatile. Fu Yuhing was relieved by her irritable tone just now. He reached out and tugged at her blanket. Why are you still turning on the air conditioner? After Fu Yuhing finished speaking, he walked to the table, picked up the remote control of the air conditioner, and raised the temperature. Then he opened the closet, took out a thicker blanket, and wrapped it around her. Wei Wei Bai did not say anything and continued to curl up in the blanket. Although the temperature of the air conditioner was raised, it was still cold. The thicker the blanket, the more comfortable it was. The young man went downstairs to make warm brown sugar water. This was a placebo for menstruation. This thing could only replenish sugar. However, sugar made people happy. At times like this, they felt more comfortable, especially when the sugar water was warm. As for replenishing blood and relieving pain, that was just wishful thinking. When he returned to the room, Wei Wei Bai was already half asleep with her eyes closed. Pain usually lasted for a while. She had probably reached the period when it was not that painful. Fu Yuhing walked to the bedside and squatted down calmly. Drink some water to replenish your sugar. She likes sweet ones. And it likes cold things. This was also one of the causes of menstrual pain. Wei Wei Bai lifted her eyelids. She snorted and said lazily, I don't want to drink anymore. I don't want to get up. Fu Yuheng thought for a moment and nodded. There's no need to get up. Just drink it like this. Then, he took out a disposable straw, placed it in the bowl, and placed the end of the straw next to Wei Wei Bai's lips. He said calmly, "Drink it." Wei Wei Bai finally opened her eyes. She looked at him motionlessly for a while before opening her mouth and sucking on the straw. Then, she drank half of the brown sugar water. After drinking it, she frowned and said disdainfully, "I don't want to drink anymore. It's too sweet." She was really hard to please. The young man thought lightly and then put the bowl on the table next to him. Then, he said to her, "Does it still hurt?" Wei Wei Bai replied weakly, "It doesn't hurt much. I'm just tired." It was normal to be tired at this time. He was silent for a while before taking out his phone and looking through the information. "What medicine do you like? I'll get it for you." He said some medicine for menstrual pain. Wei Wei Bai said lazily, "It doesn't hurt much anymore. If I don't take medicine, painkillers are not good for me." Fu Yuheng removed his finger from the phone and let the screen turn black before putting it aside. He turned and went to the bathroom. Not long after, he came out with a basin. There was a clean towel soaking in the warm water. He wrung the towel dry, bent down, and reached out. He pulled the blanket away and wiped her face. Wei Wei Bai was stunned. The warm and clean water made her squint her eyes comfortably. Fu Yuheng carefully used the warm towel to wipe her hands and feet. Wei Wei Bai pursed her lips and suddenly whispered, "Don't be so nice to me, Fu Yuheng." Fu Yuheng lowered his head. After warming her feet, he was about to look for a hot water bottle. These words caused him to pause in his actions. Then, the girl's lazy voice sounded a little heartless. "Be careful, I'll fall in love with you. /comma. Chapter 3089. There was no sincerity in her words at all. When Fu Yuheng heard this, he just covered her face with a warm towel indifferently. His voice was incomparably calm. "Be careful that I don't fall in love with you." After saying that, he wiped her face. She almost suffocated to death. The calmer Fu Yuheng was, the more morbid his words sounded. Wei Wei Bai immediately shrank back. She just glared at him without saying anything. He covered her with the blanket and sat on her bed. He reached out and stroked her hair. "Go to sleep." Wei Wei Bai felt a little more comfortable. She buried herself in the blanket and impatiently slapped his fingers away. "I'm hungry," she said sullenly. Willful and hateful. She was like a spoiled brat. Fu Yuheng looked at her for a while before he resigned himself to his fate and went out to get her supper. In the kitchen, the nanny left behind seafood porridge for them. There was a lot of crab meat. Why did this seem a little cold? Although Fu Yuheng didn't really believe in the difference between cold and heat, he thought of Wei Wei Bai's pale face and how she usually wore suspenders and ate ice cream. That was how menstrual pain was faked. He reached out and rolled up his sleeves to reveal his beautiful wrists. Then, he opened the fridge and took out the brown sugar jar. He went to the cabinet where the dry goods were stored and found red dates and other things that were said to be able to replenish blood and qi. Then, he went to get the glutinous rice expressionlessly. These things couldn't be replenished. But it was said to be comfortable. Because when a person was cold, sweet things would make them feel comfortable. In Wei Wei Bai's condition, her body showed that she was afraid of the cold. Fu Yuheng calmly used his poor knowledge of menstrual pain to deal with it. She should be able to eat the glutinous rice porridge with red dates and brown sugar. Then, it took him a while to cook the porridge. Wei Wei Bai, who was waiting for supper, was already lying on the bed on the verge of death. Why did it take so long to get supper? Did it take the sun to get it? Or did it circle the earth 3 times? Suddenly, the door opened and Fu Yuheng walked in with supper. Wei Wei Bai was hungry. She sat up obediently and reached out to take the supper. The girl sat on the bed, wrapped in a quilt. He refused to get out of bed. Fu Yuheng felt that her habits were too bad. You can't eat in bed. Wei Wei Bai's face was pale and she didn't want to move. Then I won't eat. Fu Yuheng, if it weren't for his patience, he would have killed her. Believe it or not. This was the first time Fu Yuheng had experienced such a capricious person. He frowned and continued to pick up the spoon. Then she said, "Sit closer. Don't eat on the bed." Wei Wei Bai thought about it and agreed. She moved like a snail until she reached the edge of the bed. Just as she was about to reach for the bowl, the youth calmly said, "Open your mouth." Wei Wei Bai instinctively opened her mouth and a spoonful of sweet glutinous rice porridge was stuffed into her mouth. She was stunned for a moment and her eyes widened a little. The youth calmly lowered his eyelashes and continued to feed her porridge unhurriedly. Wei Wei Bai pursed her lips and then said vaguely, "It's hot." Fu Yuheng paused, then lowered his head and gently blew on the food. Wei Wei Bai was satisfied. However, the youth felt that he had become a full-time nanny. Moreover, in a normal sugar daddy contract, shouldn't his little lover serve him? Why did he feel that he had signed back an ancestor? Wei Wei Bai didn't know what he was thinking. After eating supper, she still had to painstakingly wash up and brush her teeth once before slowly returning to bed to sleep. The youth calmly cleaned up the bowls and chopsticks. Chapter 30-90. After washing the dishes, he came to her room with these books. He saw that she was curled up in a ball again, but her face was a little rosy. The strange feeling of serving someone just now also disappeared. As long as she was comfortable. Fu Yuheng didn't react at all. His mentality didn't seem like he was treating a contractual lover. Instead, it was more like he was taking care of her as his little girlfriend. He sat calmly beside her, reading a book. Wei Wei Bai was sleepy and muttered softly, "What are you reading? You like to study so much." Fu Yuheng looked at the original business book in his hand and said calmly, "Reading before bed. It's very relaxing." "Wei Wei Bai, do you know how to read stories? Read them to me." Her tone sounded like she was ordering a servant. Fu Yuheng, who rarely stayed in the same room with girls and was inexperienced in this aspect, felt that something was wrong. But he still indulged her. Then he said a paragraph in a low voice. "Wei Wei Bai," he continued to read. Wei Wei Bai finally said, "I don't understand." "Fu Yuheng, you haven't learned French." "Wei Wei Bai." "Fuck." The youth smiled as if he felt that the prank had succeeded. She tugged at the blanket again. "Stop reading. Go back to your room and sleep. While my relatives are here, you can't do anything. Even if no relatives were here." He didn't seem to do anything to her. Fu Yuheng continued to flip the book indifferently and said perfunctorily, "I'll leave when you're asleep." Wei Wei Bai believed him and then she slept peacefully. During this period of time, it wasn't only the youth who had gotten used to sleeping with her. She actually didn't have much defense against him anymore. In the quiet night, under the dim yellow light, the youth absent-mindedly read for a while before putting the book on the table. Then he lay down because she had a pillow on the bed. So he squeezed it. The pillow was still enough for 2 people to sleep. As long as they hugged each other. He reached out and pulled her into his arms. Then he calmly closed his eyes and began to sleep. Sure enough, with a pillow, the quality of his sleep was restored. The girl seemed to have felt his warmth as well. She rubbed against him and squeezed closer until her back was pressed against his chest. Only then was she satisfied. Wei Wei Bai was having a good time at Fu Yuheng's house. She was just waiting for the right time to pay for it with her body. Summer vacation was almost over. Even the firewood hadn't started burning yet. He really had to admire Fu Yuheng for being polite and well-mannered. The contract had been signed for a long time. Why aren't the meat dishes served yet? Of course, based on her character, she wouldn't pounce on him head-on. Just like that, there was a deadlock. Wei Wei Bai had just finished her ice cream when she heard the system say, "The male lead has been plotting recently." Wei Wei Bai was searching for canned fruit in the fridge. She found a can of yellow peaches. The taste was not bad. After opening it, she picked up a fork and began to eat. What kind of trap? Life was too good. She had already gained 0.5 kilograms. She had to eat some fruits to reduce her weight. The system said, some of the employees that he fired were bold enough to kidnap and kill the only successor of the Fu family. They wanted to regain control of the company. Early on, something happened to Fu Yuheng's family. The old man couldn't handle it alone, so he promoted a group of elites to help manage the company. In the end, it was easier to invite the devil and then to send him away. When Fu Yuheng started to have the ability to manage the company, he found that a lot of power was firmly controlled by this group of people. These 2 years, Fu Yuheng had basically been doing things that offended people. Chapter 3091. The so-called reform was to take back the power of their own family from the hands of outsiders. They had offended too many people in the past 2 years. Fu Yuheng was too young, his methods were too fierce, and his temperament showed the ruthlessness of an old man. This led to this group of people knowing that after Fu Yuheng grew up for a few more years, there would be nothing for them to do. Especially when they were forced to retire by Fu Yuheng, their hatred deepened. Old Master Fu was even more ruthless, directly pushing Fu Yuheng out to handle everything by himself. He thought he was old. Fu Yuheng's father was a pile of mud. As a result, at the old master's age, to cultivate a successor, he could only use extreme methods. Like an old eagle pushing a young eagle, hating him for pushing him off the cliff. Letting him fly by himself. Fortunately, Fu Yuheng's wings were strong, and he flew quite well. Wei Wei Bai looked at the information sent by the system. The system added, this kidnapping and killing is to get rid of the male lead, so that the old master has no successor and can only continue to rely on them. Wei Wei Bai nodded. So Fu Yuheng beat them at their own game. The system said, can this plan be used? Wei Wei Bai touched her face, then continued to eat the yellow peach, saying lazily, we'll talk about it later, I'll see if there's a breakthrough point. Fu Yuheng already knew about this plot. There must be various ways to deal with it. If it was another way, there would be no breakthrough point. But if it was a trick of self-injury, then she would have a chance. The breakthrough time was free. Wei Wei Bai did not have such a pressing mentality. After all these planes, she had accumulated experience. One of them was that if time was long enough, they could get along with each other casually. There was no need to be desperate. After all, it was tiring to be desperate. The super old greasy salted fish conqueror sighed faintly, then continued to eat snacks. Halfway through, she heard the system roar, the male lead is planning to be kidnapped, he's going to play the trick of self-injury. Wei Wei Bai almost choked to death on the yellow peach. She put down the can, then stood up, put on the sunscreen, and said, then I'll go suffer with him immediately. If he didn't suffer, how could his favorability suddenly increase? His summer vacation was coming to an end, and his dry days were over. If he started going to school, he would have less contact with them. He had to increase his favorability before the summer break. Bai Weiwei pondered as she carried her small bag and stepped out in her sandals. She glanced at the map given by the system. Because they weren't sure about places that were too far away, the map was very simple. There was only a general address. Weiwei Bai bought a strawberry ice cream and ate it as she walked. When he reached the street where Fu Yuheng was, he still hadn't found Fu Yuheng. Then, he saw a yellow-haired brat running over excitedly. Weiwei, I haven't seen you for a long time. Weiwei Bai stopped in her tracks. Who was this? The system said, a friend of the original host, a fair-weather friend. In the past, the original owner was a delinquent girl. The people she knew were all bad at school, playful, and all kinds of bad friends. Although he didn't do anything terrible. He wasn't a good student either. Weiwei Bai nodded and said perfunctorily, yeah, the weather is hot recently. My parents don't let me go out, afraid that I'll get a heatstroke. The yellow-haired brat immediately laughed. Why did you change so much? You even listen to your parents. Not cool at all. We're going to the KTV tonight, you should come too. Bai Weiwei was just about to smile and say she wouldn't go. But she heard the system say, the male lead is here, he's in the car. To make it easier for you to read next time, you can click the button at the bottom to record this reading record. Chapter 3092. Weiwei Bai tilted her head and waited for the car to slowly drive over. Suddenly, she revealed an incomparably sweet smile. Let's go together. I miss the days when I sang and danced with you. That smile and that joyful tone of voice. It gave people a feeling of love. Listening to it made their ears tingle. The car suddenly stopped. Originally, the people who saw the girl sitting in the car ignored her and just walked over. After all, the plan had already started and there was no turning back. The young man sat in the back seat and looked up coldly. The window was half open. He saw the girl eating Tian strawberry ice cream and licking the strawberries with the tip of her tongue. She was delicate and youthful. And in front of her, a yellow-haired boy looked at her in a daze. The driver said, "We have to go, young master." Fu Yuheng's eyelashes trembled. His fingers clenched slightly. His fingertips pierced his flesh. It didn't hurt. But it made him sober. Yes, let's go. However, he heard the girl's happy voice beside the car. I'm not going home tonight. Let's play all night. If it's too late, I'll go to your house for the night. As soon as this sentence came out, the young man's fingertips clenched tightly. His short and round fingernails pierced into his flesh. It hurt. The young man lowered his eyes. It was cold to the bone. He asked the driver, "Are they here?" The driver lowered his head and used a wireless communication tool to communicate with someone for a while. There are still about 10 minutes. Fu Yuheng narrowed his eyes and nodded. Then, he opened the car door without hesitation. Weiwei Bai was playing with the yellow-haired boy. Remember to buy me a new toothbrush. I can use it when I wake up tomorrow morning. The towel doesn't matter. I can use yours. The yellow-haired boy was dizzy and wanted to refuse. He was 1 year away from adulthood. If he dyed his hair and didn't study, his parents would beat him to death. If he dared to bring a girl home, they would beat him to death without explanation. Although he liked Weiwei Bai very much, he couldn't bring her home. If he didn't bring her home, he could still take advantage of her. Weiwei Bai was so gullible. After bullying her, he didn't need to take responsibility. The yellow-haired boy immediately smiled and reached out to hold Weiwei Bai's hand. Then let's go quickly. Just as he stretched out his hand, little Yellow Feather suddenly felt something tighten at the back of his neck. A huge force grabbed his collar and pulled him back. Little Yellow Feather's tongue was stuck out. His eyes widened in horror, and in the next moment, he was thrown to the ground by this force. Little Yellow Feather was dumbfounded. He felt like his neck was about to break. He stretched out his hands to cover the back of his neck and looked up in shock. Then, he saw a handsome and cold youth. His cold eyes were emotionless. He walked over, extended his long leg, and kicked the youth's waist. This caused Little Yellow Feather to roll on the ground in pain. Fu Yuheng calmly rolled down his sleeves and said, "Who allowed you to touch her?" Little Yellow Hair was so scared that he almost peed himself. Where did this killing god come from? He was simply not giving anyone a way out. He hurriedly wailed and howled, "Big brother, I didn't touch her." Fu Yuheng calmly walked over and then squatted down. His handsome face was covered with a layer of frightening gloominess. His tone was calm, but his words were enough to scare someone to death. "The next time I see you, I'll break your arms and legs." Little Yellow Feather cried and immediately ran away while crying. He was afraid that if he ran too slowly, his arms and legs would be broken. The youth with the cold eyes then slowly stood up, as if the person who threatened him was someone else. Wei Wei Bai held the ice cream in her hand and slowly blinked, as if she was scared silly. Fu Yuheng reached out and grabbed her arm. He dragged her forcefully and then stuffed her into the car. The chauffeur immediately started driving. The youth was also silent and did not say anything. Only then did Wei Wei Bai dare to secretly take a bite of the ice cream that was about to melt. However, she heard him ask softly, "Do you like that guy just now?" Wei Wei Bai was stunned. This was a death sentence question. She immediately laughed heartlessly and said, "How could that be? Don't I like you the most? Big brother." This sentence of liking was not sincere at all. Fu Yuheng slowly turned his head, his beautiful eyes suppressing a gloom. He laughed coldly. "The next time you dare to seduce others, I'll break your legs so that you won't be able to go out anymore." This sentence was frighteningly serious. It did not seem like a joke at all. // For the convenience of your next reading, you can click on the save button, comma. Chapter 3093. Wei Wei Bai seemed to be frightened. She looked at him blankly and then ate the last strawberry on the ice cream. It wouldn't be cold if she didn't eat it. The strawberry tasted good. She licked the corner of her lips. As for the little cutie Fu's threat, what was the difference between it and the usual saying that the weather was hot today? Except that her eyes were wide open. There didn't seem to be any difference. Big Boss Wei was very calm inside. If you have the guts, go ahead and become black. Even if you become black as charcoal, she wouldn't be afraid. Of course, she still had to show her character, so she glanced sideways and smiled coldly. Got it. There was no sincerity and a perfunctory attitude. Fu Yuheng's expression was still calm, but the gloominess in his eyes was still there. He turned his face, his beautiful eyes half closed, so cold that it was frightening. Wei Wei Bai finished the ice cream in her hand and went to wipe her hands like a child without a care in the world. She lowered her head, completely ignoring the emotions of the young man beside her. Suddenly, the person beside her raised his hand, pinched her chin, and forced her to look up. Wei Wei Bai's eyes were a little confused. Fu Yuheng looked at her calmly for a while, then said in a low voice, "If you don't like it, don't tease people like that." When he hit that little yellow hair just now, she didn't panic at all, nor did she feel sorry for him. She didn't even have the intention to stop him. Her behavior was too frivolous. There was no sense of boundaries. If she met a bigoted person, she would be strangled to death sooner or later. Wei Wei Bai's eyelashes fluttered, and she suddenly grabbed his wrist, saying angrily, "Can you not pinch my chin?" Fu Yuheng saw her stupid and naive look. He couldn't help but narrow his eyes, but he didn't move his hand from her wrist. Finally, the little girl was scared. She pursed her lips, and there was a trace of fear in her eyes. Then her voice softened. "Got it, I won't do it again." This sentence was different from the perfunctory one just now. It was more of a grievance of being oppressed by the strong and having no choice but to accept threats. Fu Yuheng looked at her coldly for a while, then suddenly released his fingers, raised his wrist, and looked at his watch. A few minutes had passed. The other party was about to meet his opponent. He said coldly to the driver, "Stop the car." He didn't have time to send her home. She could only ask her to get off the car halfway. As an outsider, she couldn't get involved in today's kidnapping. The best thing to do just now was to ignore her. This way, she wouldn't be in any danger at all. But to see her smiling sweetly at someone, even going home with a boy for the night. His mind buzzed. Logic and reason had all lost to the killing intent in that instant. He wanted to make little yellow hair completely disappear from this world. If it wasn't for Li Meng's cold stare from the beginning to the end, watching him hit people. He reckoned that a few of little yellow hair's bones would be broken by his kick. In the past, he had always mocked others for being blinded by foolish anger. He had done a lot of things that he would never have done if he was calm. In the end, when it was his turn. Only then did he realize that stupid things could be done so easily. Wei Wei Bai's eyes lit up. "Are you busy? Then put me down immediately, I'm in the way." Would anyone praise themselves like that? Fu Yuheng saw how happy she was and how eager she was to get off the car. The young man's thin lips couldn't help but curl up into a cold smile. But this matter was too important, and his life was in danger. He would settle the score with her when the matter was over. So he didn't stop her and started to park the car / to facilitate the next reading, you can click on. Chapter 3094. However, Wei Wei Bai said, "Uncle Driver, stop at the shadowy place in front. The weather is so hot. I will get heatstroke if I expose myself to the scorching sun." The driver was very nervous and planned to stop the car directly. However, Fu Yuheng did not say anything and could only continue driving. The shadow of the huge building was about to reach them. The driver suddenly heard a hurried voice coming from his earpiece. His pupils constricted and he immediately said to Fu Yuheng, "It's here." Fu Yuheng frowned and almost without hesitation, he reached out and grabbed Wei Wei Bai's arm, pulled her into his arms, and shouted, "Step on the accelerator." But it was too late. A few cars appeared out of nowhere and sped towards them from all directions. A car crashed into the front of Fu Yuheng's car with a suicidal posture. A violent collision. The people in the car were shocked. The girl in Fu Yuheng's arms gasped in horror. From those black cars, a dozen to 20 tall masked men holding iron hammers quickly jumped down from those black cars. They directly smashed the window of the back seat where Fu Yuheng was sitting and professionally opened the door. They took out a terrifyingly sharp knife. Get down, to make Fu Yuheng afraid, the criminal saw the girl in his arms and stabbed her without thinking. He planned to kill the girl. To deter Fu Yuheng. As for who the girl was and what the impact of her death was, it did not matter to them. Because their target was only Fu Yuheng. Wei Wei Bai was tightly pressed in the youth's arms. She resisted the impact and had her back to the car door. So when the dagger was sent to her back, there was no chance of dodging at all. The tip of the knife was about to touch the girl's thin sunscreen jacket. In the next moment, Fu Yuheng reached out fiercely. At the critical moment, his fingers grabbed the criminal's dagger. Blood dripped from his palms. The criminal trembled. They were paid to do things. The higher-ups needed a complete Fu Yuheng. If he was injured, it would not be easy to get money. He immediately let go because it was in time. Fu Yuheng's wound was not deep. It was just a scratch. The blood fell on the girl's neck, and the chill made her shiver. Fu Yuheng frowned and said to the criminals, "I'll go with you." With that said, he was about to push her away. However, he found that he couldn't push it away. She was so scared that she hugged his waist tightly with both hands. Due to the urgency of the situation, the criminal did not give Fu Yuheng any time to react. He directly grabbed Fu Yuheng's arm and dragged him outside. However, Wei Wei Bai was dragging his waist with all her might. Just like that, the two of them were dragged to the enemy's car like conjoined dolls. If Fu Yuheng had been able to remain calm in the beginning. When Wei Wei Bai followed him into the car, he couldn't help but frown. Both of them were covered with a black cover. Because Wei Wei Bai was hugging the boy too tightly and time was tight, no one tried to pull her away. Therefore, she continued to curl up in Fu Yuheng's arms. The young man was also afraid that something would happen to her. He reached out and pressed her back, protecting her in his arms. He sensed that she was afraid. His body kept trembling. The little girl had never seen such a big scene. Therefore, she was frightened for a moment. He felt that it was normal. But she shouldn't have hugged him so tightly just now. Shouldn't a normal person let go of him and immediately shrink to the other side of the car? Perhaps she was too scared and thought that his arms were the safest place. When this thought appeared, Fu Yuheng couldn't help but purse his lips. / at the bottom to record this reading record. Chapter 3095. He didn't really care about her shit-stirring behavior anymore. Suddenly, he heard Wei Wei Bai say softly, her voice trembling. "Fu Yuheng, are you okay?" Her voice was too soft, like a breath blowing against his neck. He couldn't hear anything clearly. But Fu Yuheng understood what he meant. He was silent for a while before replying in a low voice, "I'm fine." The black cover was made of breathable thin cotton cloth. It was just to prevent them from seeing the road, not to suffocate them. Their voices could also be heard. The girl in his arms heaved a sigh of relief and said aggrievedly, "You scared me to death." Fu Yuheng couldn't help but mock, "You were so scared that you kept holding on to me and got tied up together." Her actions just now were so stupid that it gave him a headache. Wei Wei Bai was stunned, and then she didn't say anything. It was as if she knew that she was wrong. Fu Yuheng didn't blame her again. After all, it was natural for her to be scared for a moment. It was still his fault. He shouldn't have let her get into the car because of anger. Even after beating up the blonde. Then leaving her where she was the right thing to do. But losing his mind made him lose his judgment. He let this mistake hatch successfully. When the car stopped, the criminals opened the door and wanted to pull them down. Wei Wei Bai was pulled away from his arms, and the black cover was also pulled away. Her fingers were still holding the youth's arm tightly. She had no intention of relaxing at all. This was an abandoned hospital. It was unusually eerie and terrifying. But most people wouldn't think that there was someone hiding here. Fu Yuheng's expression was indifferent as he glanced at those people. None of them showed their true faces. This meant that the group of people who gave the order hadn't given the order to kill the hostage. So no one took the risk of exposing themselves. He glanced at the hospital again before following in. From the beginning to the end, he was one step ahead and protected the girl who was holding his hand behind him. The two of them were locked in an abandoned ward. The white walls of the ward had begun to peel off. The bed was made of iron, and there was no bedding. The ruffians locked the door from the outside with a big iron chain. Wei Wei Bai couldn't help but purse her lips as she listened to the clanking of the chains. She lowered her head and her eyes turned red. Fu Yuheng glanced at her and pulled her to the bedside. Then, he took out a handkerchief from his pocket and wiped the bed. He sat her down on the bed. Then he lowered his head and covered her forehead with his hand. His dark eyes stared at her. His voice was slightly hoarse. "Don't be afraid, I'm here." Wei Wei Bai raised her red eyes and looked at him. She sniffled and said in a hoarse voice, "Did I cause you any trouble?" Fu Yuheng looked at her pitiful eyes and narrowed his eyes. "You've just realized that your ability to deal with crises is too poor. Their target is me, but you're good. You brought yourself along. Buy one, get one free." Wei Wei Bai fell silent. Then she turned her face, her eyelashes trembling slightly. "I wanted to let go of you immediately, but when I thought of you being kidnapped, I was so scared that I didn't dare to let go. I thought that this would delay your capture." This sentence made her frown. "You're stupid. The act of hugging you will only cause you more trouble. Root can save you." Fu Yuheng thought that she was just scared and didn't know how to let go. He didn't expect this answer. His calm expression had a hint of sluggishness. Although it was only for a moment, it was unusually rare. Fu Yuheng thought for a moment before sitting beside her. He reached out and put his arm around her shoulders, bringing her into his embrace. Chapter 3096. Then he lowered his eyes and said in a low voice, "I thought you hated me." Wei Wei Bai replied in a muffled voice, "I hate you." Fu Yuheng, "Hate me so much that you want to save me?" Wei Wei Bai couldn't say anything for a while, so she could only repeat, "I hate you." Fu Yuheng couldn't help but smile, then he sighed. They were so silly. Then he lowered his head and kissed her cheek. The boy's voice was soft and gentle. I know you hate me." Ding, the male lead's favorability is at 50. There was no signal in this hospital, which was why they weren't searched. They couldn't make a call. Fu Yuheng told Wei Wei Bai, who was desperately calling the police, that there was a signal jammer here. The girl looked at him blankly. "Why does it seem like a movie?" Fu Yuheng pondered for a moment before nodding slowly. To a certain extent, it is indeed a movie. He knew that there was a kidnapping activity, so deliberately being kidnapped to lure the snake out of its hole was a kind of acting method. After the kidnapping, the other side acted like they wanted money, but they planned to kill the hostage as soon as they got the money, so that the Fu family would lose their successor, so that they could return to the company. This was also an act. He just didn't know who acted better. The criminal had been here once and placed 2 bowls of instant noodles on the abandoned metal table. It seemed that the ransom was still being negotiated, so it would take a long time. Giving them instant noodles was to not let them starve to death. When the criminal was about to leave, Wei Wei Bai suddenly called out to him, "Big brother, can you give me medical bandages and disinfectant?" The bandit fiercely turned his head around. The 2 eye holes in his mask revealed a terrifying look of ruthlessness. "What do you want this for?" Wei Wei Bai was scared, her fingers clutching the clothes of the boy beside her. Then she still straightened her little neck and shouted, "Didn't you want a lot of ransom? Your vault is damaged with a knife. If you don't treat the tetanus in time and die, you won't have any money." Because she was too scared, she shouted out loud. The criminal was stunned by the roar. Wei Wei Bai immediately followed up with another attack. "Also, just treat it as a purchase. You can increase the ransom, add the money for the drugs, and add the money for the instant noodles. Wouldn't you be able to earn more?" This reason was too strong. Fu Yuheng raised his eyebrows and looked at her indifferently. When he heard what she said, he couldn't help but laugh. He was amused. This was the first time he could negotiate with a criminal like this. He actually used ransom money to buy something from the criminal. The gangster was fooled into a daze. In the end, he really did throw in an expired bandage and a bottle of disinfectant that was about to expire. It might have been found in an abandoned hospital. Wei Wei Bai took the bandage and immediately frowned at Fu Yuheng. "Open your fingers." He was silent for a while before he slowly spread out his injured hand. Flesh rotted out of the cut skin, and blood was still flowing out. However, there wasn't much blood, and he was afraid of scaring her, so he kept rubbing the blood on his black pants. As a result, his wound became much more serious. His hand was full of bright red blood. Wei Wei Bai looked at him, and tears welled up in her eyes. She gritted her teeth and immediately began to wipe the blood off him with a bandage. She carefully wiped and complained in a hoarse voice, "Why do you have to go to this extent for a worthless lover? What if your fingers are crippled?" Fu Yuheng saw her drooping eyelashes trembling slightly. Was this girl really made of water? She could really cry at the slightest thing. He looked at his wound indifferently. "I know what to do. I won't be crippled." When he said this, he saw the girl in front of him look up fiercely. The mist in her eyes was replaced by a clear light. It was out of anger. "Don't do this in the future. I'm not grateful to you." She gritted her teeth and lowered her head to wipe him with disinfectant. Her voice couldn't help but soften. "It hurts a lot. Bear with it." It was as cute as coaxing a child. Fu Yuheng stared at her silently, and a smile slowly appeared in his dark eyes. Then he responded in a low voice. "When I see you, I don't feel much pain. Maybe it's a little itchy." His heart itched. /crossover system, Adonis, come over here, comma. Chapter 3097. Instant noodles were spicy. For some reason, Wei Wei Bai's taste buds didn't like spicy food. When she ate the first mouthful of instant noodles, she was stunned and felt that the tip of her tongue was about to explode. But she was also very hungry. So she ate the second mouthful with difficulty. Then her eyes turned red. It was red from the spiciness. She glanced at the packaging outside the instant noodles bucket. Super spicy beef pickled vegetable noodles. God, you're special grade. Why did a pervert like such spicy food? Fu Yuheng looked like an elegant young master, but he wasn't picky about food at all. Even when she was eating the instant noodles with a disposable fork, she was slow and elegant. He made the super spicy instant noodles feel like a 5-star meal. He was just short of wearing a suit and tie. The corners of her mouth twitched. The system had already checked most of it. Just now, she went through the information given by the system. She found that this guy was a wolf in sheep's clothing. Although it was a kidnapping, there were a few of his people in the kidnapping. To cooperate with this kidnapping, Fu Yuheng had been busy for an entire week. He was afraid that if any step was not true, the planners would become vigilant. Eating instant noodles was also a way to let the other party let down their guard. After all, who would see a hostage eating a feast, right? Although she knew that if Fu Yuheng gave the order, his people might still be able to get some good food. But this guy probably wouldn't even make such a small mistake. Wei Wei Bai thought it through and could only continue. She tried her best to stuff the instant noodles into her mouth. She tried her best not to touch the soup. It was still spicy. Suddenly, a hand took away the instant noodles in front of her. Wei Wei Bai still had half a piece of noodles in her mouth. It hung in the air, and her round black eyes were filled with tears from the spiciness. She looked at her noodles pitifully. After it was taken away by the youth, she watched as he slowly picked up her noodles with a fork, rolled them up, and brought them to his beautiful lips. With one bite, he ate them. He ate, he ate, he ate. She quickly stuffed the noodles into her mouth. It was so spicy that she teared up again. Then, she hurriedly looked at Fu Yuheng's instant noodles bucket. It was gone. Even the soup was left. This guy could actually eat spicy food without batting an eyelid. Most importantly, he actually snatched her food and ate it himself. This guy's heart was actually so black. In such a starving situation, the goal was to rob her of her only source of food. Then he would eat it in front of her. What kind of fucking selfishness was that? Fu Yuheng saw her staring at him. He continued to eat the noodles with a calm expression. When he finished the soup, he felt that he should explain himself. So he said slowly, "I can see that you're afraid of spicy food. You'd better not eat it, lest you get diarrhea." Wei Bai, Fu Yuheng was afraid that she did not understand. There is no bathroom in the abandoned ward, and there is no extra water. If you have diarrhea, you can only go to the corner. You probably won't like it. It was a plausible explanation. He had successfully made the starving Wei Bai lose all her appetite. Fu Yuheng could actually eat spicy instant noodles without batting an eyelid and discussed the problem of diarrhea with her. Wei Bai felt that this guy, who won't succeed, his opponents would be committing a sin if they met him. Wei Bai touched her nose and felt disgusted. Then she obediently retracted her feet on the iron bed, hugged her legs with both hands, and waited for Fu Yuheng with reddened eyes. Big Boss Fu's face was calm as he drank the last bit of soup. // Chapter 3098. Wei Bai couldn't help but say, "You rarely eat this. Will you have diarrhea if you eat too much?" Fu Yuheng put the fork and paper bucket of instant noodles on the table and tidied them up. He said calmly, "I've eaten it before. I'm used to it." Wei Bai looked at him in confusion, as if she didn't understand why he was used to eating this thing. Fu Yuheng saw that the girl's eyes were red, and there was a hint of innocent curiosity in them. She was like a rabbit that popped out of a hole. She was looking at him silently with pitiful eyes. His heart softened and he couldn't help but explain, "I left my family's company at the age of 15 to work on my own. In the beginning, to succeed in the project, I ate and lived with the employees. I even stayed up all night in the company and often ate instant noodles for supper. Because the old master was not satisfied with him running away. He cut off his funds and didn't allow him to have any privileges. Even his bank cards were frozen. That year, he basically understood what it meant to be inconvenient. For example, when the company's renovation was not complete. He slept in the company directly. He would just pull a cardboard under his body and then sleep with a blanket that cost 9 yuan online. He ate too much instant noodles and takeout. He also knew which brands were better and had a better investment future. These were only the first year. In the next few years, his performance improved, and his standard of living rose sharply. When Wei Bai heard him say this, the mist in her eyes gradually dissipated, and a clear light appeared. Fu Yuheng saw her gaze and was slightly stunned. He was familiar with this gaze. His employees and business partners would often look at him with this kind of excited gaze. Because he led them and succeeded in achieving great results. It was just a look of worship. It was just that they were not as pure and cute as the girl in front of him, or even loyal. She couldn't help but whisper, "You're quite amazing." Fu Yuheng looked at her lightly. His thin lips curled slightly, but he was not modest. The girl lowered her eyes. "Compared to you, I'm really not good at anything." Fu Yuheng said calmly, "You're very amazing. Don't underestimate yourself." Wei Bai's eyes immediately lit up and she said happily, "How am I amazing?" Fu Yuheng, don't take my words too seriously. However, she did have her own strengths. For example, she could make his eyes follow her everywhere. Make him angry. Make way for me. Or even, jealousy. Once this feeling surged up, it was almost impossible to suppress. Fu Yuheng felt like she was his first love. The belated young man stared at her blankly for a while before reaching out and patting her head. You're the best when it comes to provoking me. It made him upset. She was the first. Wasn't that impressive? Ding, the male lead's favorability is at 55. When Wei Wei Bai saw that the male lead had reluctantly opened his eyes, she finally realized that his feelings for her were not that of a contracted lover. Naturally, his favorability towards him increased a little. The young and inexperienced emotions of a youth would not be able to withstand any disaster. But she still liked him. Even so, she was not enlightened. Therefore, her expression became sluggish. Suddenly, like an evil dragon, she glared at him fiercely. Humph, I'm the first to make you angry. Be careful, don't die from anger. Fu Yuheng smiled. His dark eyes were filled with joy. His finger lightly fell on the tip of her nose. Her nose was still a little red from eating spicy food. His finger lightly rubbed against the tip of her nose. This was a cute and intimate action. Hungry. /T. Chapter 3099. He asked softly. Wei Wei Bai narrowed her eyes and snorted, but she didn't answer. However, a slight rumbling sound came from her stomach. This was awkward. Fu Yuheng couldn't help but smile even more. Why, don't you call me brother? I'll get someone to make you some delicious food. Wei Wei Bai sneered. You're a hostage now. Who listens to you? Fu Yuheng, trust me. Wei Wei Bai thought for a while before reluctantly saying, Brother, I'm hungry. She was completely insincere. She didn't even use a word when calling him. Fu Yuheng wasn't picky. He got off the bed and walked to the door. Wei Wei Bai immediately called out to him, Don't feed me. I'm not hungry. Fu Yuheng ignored her and knocked on the door. The criminal immediately responded fiercely, What do you want? Fu Yuheng said indifferently, Do you want to earn money? The criminal sneered. Aren't you just our money? Fu Yuheng, the ransom is still being negotiated. How can money that hasn't been received be considered money? I have a card with me. I'll tell you the password. You can get it immediately. The criminal was stunned and didn't respond. Fu Yuheng's face was calm, and his voice was emotionless. It was as if he was talking about a trivial matter. There's about a few million in the card. You guys are fast enough and your methods are professional enough. You should be able to safely transfer it out by tonight. Fu Yuheng's voice darkened as he said this. There was even a hint of magnetism. It was so pleasant that it could bewitch people. But you have to think carefully. Before the ransom is negotiated, you can't torture me. If I don't tell you the password, you won't be able to take out the money in the card. That was indeed the case. The criminal was tempted. What do you want to do? Fu Yuheng, give me a better environment. Also, I want a higher standard for dinner. As for how high, you've checked my information. You can order food wherever I eat. The criminal hesitated for a while before saying, Give me the card. Fu Yuheng nodded and took out his wallet from his jacket. After taking out his card, he took it out. At the same time, he also took a stack of $100 bills and put them on the ground together with the card and pushed them out through the gap. After pushing it out, Fu Yuheng said, By the way, remember to order an extra supper. We have a habit of eating supper. Master Fu did not look like a bandit at all. It felt like he was staying in a hotel and ordering the waiters around. He said calmly, "When the matter is settled, I will tell you the password." After saying that, he deliberately added another infuriating sentence. "You don't have to worry about me going back on my word. After all, this is just a small amount of money. The cash is for your tea." Bandit, why do I feel like I've been attacked? After finishing his business, Fu Yuhan calmly tidied up his clothes and looked at the girl on the bed. She stared at him blankly, her eyes full of soft little stars. It was a little star of worship. He couldn't help but smile. He walked over and ruffled her hair. "Don't look at me like that, or I'll kiss you." Wei Wei Bai blushed and turned her head. She snorted, "Rogue." They changed to a better abandoned ward. It was obviously a VIP ward. It was much cleaner. There was even a clean bedding, a thermos of hot water, and 2 brand new cups. The most important thing was the dishes that they had spent millions on. The dishes were spread out on 2 abandoned tables. Wei Wei Bai ate while listening to Fu Yuheng tell the bandit the password. Crossover system, Adonis, come here, /crossover system, Adonis, come here, / crossover system, Adonis, come here. Crossover system, Adonis, come here. Crossover system, Adonis, come here. You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.